Hello friends, welcome to Universe of Naruto X. If you love Naruto What If stories and anime explanations, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin today's story. It was nearing the end of Sasuke's first full day at the academy, and the sun of the fading summer shone down on Mikoto as she strolled leisurely back to the school to walk her son home. She didn't have to do this. She was the Lady Uchiha and could have delegated the task to her maid if she'd wished, and no one would have thought it was odd. But Mikoto always felt it was better she complete the mundane tasks of keeping house in addition to her duties as the wife of the clan head. She was expected to be the elegant hostess, the oil that kept the cogs of clan politics running smoothly, conspicuous only in her absence. Doing the dishes or picking her son up from school didn't technically fall under this purview, but Mikoto did them anyway. She felt it kept her grounded. The thought that she was casting for excuses to be near Sasaki fluttered across her mind like a fallen leaf and disappeared. It had been too quiet in the house today. She thought it would be a relief not to have the curious 6-year-old underfoot for a while, but despite its benign cause, the silence in the large house was unsettling. Taking a long, uninterrupted bath, when was the last time she'd had one of those turned out only to make it worse? After tolling off, she'd embarked on an epic cleaning mission to the cellars instead to distract herself from the amorphous loneliness. It had worked mostly until she found a box of old photo albums in the back labeled Itachi and had to stop. At first, she'd flipped through them idly, intermittently, chuckling to herself at the memories they brought into sharper focus. Then she noticed that past the age of 8, he wasn't smiling in a single photograph. Her eldest son had been promoted to Jonin earlier this year, and ever since the simple ceremony, he'd gone from cool to unreachably distant. He was the youngest in Konoha to ever attain that rank, save Hatake Kakashi, who'd beaten the Uchiha prodigy by all of 2 months. The whole clan was terribly proud of him, his father most of all. But his reaction to the praise had been to flinch from it as if they were words of rebuke. He did his duty and did it well, but he never seemed to take the same pride in his accomplishments as his family and his peers. If Mikoto didn't know better, she would have thought he was ashamed of his skills. He had always been a reserved child, and as an active duty jonin, she'd expect him to conduct himself with more maturity than was usual for his 13 years on this earth. But this worried her deeply. When he was still a genin, he did have his unguarded moments with her, and especially with a toddling sash when a peaceful smile could be seen cracking through the hardening shinobi mask and blossoming on his lips. After Itachi shut her out of his life, she'd turned to Sasaki, who was as loving a boy as a mother could wish for. He was proud to be an UIHA without too much of the arrogance that afflicted so many of their clan. Her husband's stern face flashed in her mind's eye, and his childlike determination to become chief of police and beloved protector of Konoha never failed to lift her heart. Sending him to the academy was the first step toward his dream. A tiny part of her that she shushed without mercy was afraid it might also be the first step towards making him another Itachi. A boy made a soldier when he was so small she could still balance him on one hip. A killer before his 9th birthday, a hardened assassin by his 13th. A child with barely a childhood, she shook those dark thoughts from her mind as her steps carried her to the scruffy gardens and training fields surrounding the academy. The youngest students and a few of their parents were milling around the playground, the older ones wandering home in uneven clumps. From the far side of the lot, she picked out the head of bluish and perpetually unkempt hair and waved. She brushed it flat this morning, but unlike the rest of him, Sasake's hair could never seem to behave itself. "Hi, Mom." He whirled from his perch on the seesaw, where a skinny blonde boy was bouncing him up and down with gusto. She noted with a sniff of superiority that the Hyuga had sent some branch house member to pick up their precious pear-eyed princess from her first day of school. Haga-sama apparently couldn't be bothered. His late wife had been a sweet woman, if a bit on the timid side. It was a pity none of her loving nature had rubbed off on her husband. Among her son's other classmates, she recognized a few students from other prominent clans as well, an Arame in a hooded sweatshirt despite the heat. An Inuzuka with very sharp teeth and a fang motif imprinted below each eye. A self-assured Yamanaka with hair so blonde it was almost white, and a Nara and an Akamaiki snacking together in the grass judging from the bottle brush black ponytail and very round tattooed cheeks respectively. She greeted the assistant teacher supervising the playground on her way over a rather nervous-looking young man with a scar across the bridge of his nose. He didn't look older than mid-teens himself, and Mikoto realized this was probably his first day of school, too, albeit on the other side of the lectern. His brown eyes wandered over the pattern of red and white fans adorning the of her kimono, and he bowed very deeply. Sasuke helped me demonstrate the first taijutsu forms today. I didn't expect him to be so far ahead of the rest of his class with those sama, he said, opened his mouth, and then shut it again very quickly. I mean, of course, he's very skilled, he added and cleared his throat anxiously. I just didn't know how skilled. Just like Itachi-san. Amazing, really. Mikoto politely stifled a chuckle at his obvious discomfort. Since his father was so often working late at the police headquarters, and his brother gone on missions, she'd done a lot of Sasake's preliminary training herself. He was very good for his age, but not that good. She was guilty of spoiling him a bit and never pushed him as hard as her husband had pushed a younger Itachi. For a shinobi, the teacher wasn't very adept at hiding his body language. And what it was saying was quite clearly, oh crap. Oh crap. I just told the clan head's wife I didn't expect much out of their kid. I just got this job. Please don't get me fired. On one level, he did have a reason to be worried. The Uchiha were notoriously easy to insult, and they tended to hold grudges, too. It was a characteristic of her clan. Mikoto didn't much share, and she smiled encouragingly at the young teacher. I'm glad to hear he's doing so well, but don't be afraid to nudge him toward more practice if you think he needs it, especially in endurance training. A shinobi can only get so far on pure talent. I'll keep that in mind, he replied, absently smoothing down his hair in relief. He obviously hadn't expected her to accept his authority as an instructor gracefully, and so Mikoto made a conscious point of doing so. The prissy behavior of some of her friends in the clan towards their children's teachers was frankly embarrassing. A lot of being a good shinobi was plain hard work, no matter what kind of incredible kekjenk one had been graced with, and shortcuts and favoritism in their student days were like as not to see her friends' sons injured or killed once they faced their first real challenges in the field. Good luck with your new class, she said to him, moving again toward Sasaki. He thanked her quickly before turning to greet the next parent. Her son was still laughing and seesawing away, although he wasn't doing much of the work. The other boy was a fountain of energy and was still pushing off full strength with Nare hitch in his breath. Did you make a new friend today? She asked, strolling over to them. His name is, he began as the blonde boy finally paused in his bouncing and grinned at her. Mikoto felt the sun-kissed air and sound of children's voices fall away, replaced with cold autumn rain and the screams of the injured and the dying. She didn't hear Sasaki speak his name. She already knew the QB, the demon fox. No one knew how deep its influence on its prison went, but the whisker marks imprinted on the flesh of his cheeks were frighteningly telling. She grabbed Sasaki roughly by the arm and pulled him from his seat, tipping the other side of the seesaw against the ground with a thunk and a pained grunt from his partner. Let's go, Sasaki, she said shortly, turning away from the abomination. Her son resisted, pulling her back in the direction of the other boy. She refused to meet his eyes again, afraid of the unearthly malice she might find there if her gaze lingered. She had lost so much to that beast. Its arrival pulled her away from a retirement she'd finally made her peace with. Away from a months-old baby. Nursing mothers, the old, the crippled, the children, everyone who could walk and own a hit was thrust into service in the aftermath of that terrible day. Since so many of the Uchiha were stationed permanently in Konoha as members of the military police, their losses were staggering, the greatest in proportion to their numbers of all the major ninja clans. Mikoto herself had survived largely unscathed, but the same was not true of her family. Her mother and maternal grandparents were killed when one of the emergency shelters was reduced to rubble by an errant thrash of its tails. Her two older brothers, fraternal twins, were among the first to engage the demon and paid dearly for that selfless courage. Koichi was crushed into an unrecognizable smear of blood and viscera, and Kojiro suffered extensive chakra burns across his face and chest that resisted every medic's attempt to heal them. He survived the battle, but completely blinded and in horrific pain. The day he was lucid enough to understand what had happened to his twin, Mikoto came in to change his bandages and found him face down on the blood-soaked mattress with his tanto in his hand. Way. Sasaki wed, wriggling against her fingers and breaking the grip of the horrible memory. Mikoto snapped back to the sunny day and the pleasant bubbling of children's laughter with a sharp intake of breath. You told me this morning I should make lots of friends. Why can't Naruto be my friend? He's funny and he didn't start crying like a baby when I hit him in taijutsu class. Not like that stupid girl with pink hair. I told you we're leaving. Itachi is coming home from his mission tonight and I need to start dinner. Sasaki screwed up his face and frowned at her. He's not going to eat it anyway. He always grabs something with his team if he gets home late, and he always gets home late. Can't we stay for a little bit more? Mikoto sighed in exasperation. The perceptiveness of shinobi children wasn't always a blessing. Against her better judgment, she looked back to the fox brat. His grin had faded into an expression of vexation, and he was lamely pushing himself up and down on the seesaw, as if he couldn't care less he was now playing alone. He made no move to follow Sasaki, like he'd experienced this strange reaction many times before, and knew better than to try his luck. Now that she looked at him a second time, she noticed how thin he really was. Not growth spurt thin, either. Underfed thin. His cheeks weren't nearly as round as they could have been, and the stained t-shirt hung far too loosely from his bony shoulders. Konoha was prosperous. No child should be going without good meals, especially the son of a kage, whether or not his parentage was common knowledge. There was something desperately wrong here. A shinobi's thirst for vengeance and a mother's compassion for a hungry child intermingled in Mikoto's heart. He tried hesitantly, smiling at her again. Aside from the scrawniness and the whisker marks, it was like looking at a portrait of the Yandaime. But that smile didn't make her think of his father. It made her think of his mother and some of the last words they had spoken to each other. He'll be the same age as Sasaki, so I hope they'll be friends. She released her hold on her son, and her hand dropped slowly back to her thigh. Sasaki giggled in triumph and trotted back to Naruto's side. She let her eyes drift out of focus and back into memory while the boys resumed their games. Who did she think she was to deny the last wish of one of her dearest friends? She hated the QB like she hated no other living thing. But Naruto was something else besides the QB. He was the only son of Uzumaki Kusha. 6 years ago, she had felt the demon's killing intent sweep over her. A primal terror so intense it had taken every scrap of her willpower not to jam her own kunai into her throat just to make the feeling stop. If she let go her assumptions and looked with an analytical eye, she could see none of that malevolence emanating from the boy in front of her. She was familiar with the theory behind Fuin Jutsu, if not the practice, and knew objectively that it was possible to seal a within a human being while retaining the vessel's humanity. Although she hadn't known the secret until after her untimely death, Kusha herself was proof of that. No one had confirmed nor denied anything, not to Mikoto, but she laid the pieces out and assembled them into a perfect picture. She had been a very good student of history. She knew the Shoai Hokage possessed the ability to control the tailed beasts. She knew Uchiha Madara, the traitorous fallen lord of the Uchiha, had used the Kyuubi against him in their final confrontation at the Valley of the End. She knew that the Shoai's wife, Uzumaki Mito Uzumaki, had joined the battle to aid her dying husband, finally tipping it in the Senju's favor with her mastery of seals. Suddenly, there was no more QB, the Shodai was taken back to Konoha and healed, and everyone except Model lived happily ever after. Mito outlived her husband by a ridiculous interval, finally passing in her sleep at over 120 years old. The same year Kusha had come to live in Konoha. Her textbooks never specified what happened to it, but considering how reluctant Iowa had been to attack Konoha itself during the Third Great War, she was willing to bet it was fear of the Kyuubi that kept them from storming the walls. Looking back, it was hard to imagine the relentlessly cheerful, impulsive, free-spirited Kusha inspiring that kind of fear. She was everything the younger Mikoto hadn't been. Raised in the stifling confines of expectation and tradition, and Mikoto loved her for it. She was the bad influence who taught the clan heir's fiancé how to swear like a mercenary captain, to stumble home giggling drunk, to look the old clan head right in the eye, and refuse when he demanded she retire and marry before she made jonin. She was what kept Mikoto sane during the first rocky years of her marriage to Fugaku, before they'd made their compromises an uneasy truce. There was no way around it. She owed Kusha. "You're right, Sasaki," she said, forcing an easiness into her tone she didn't feel. "I don't know where my brain is today. Come to think of it, your father said he'd be working overtime today, too. We can eat late. Do you want to get a snack in the meantime?" "Yeah," he said with enthusiasm. "How about the Anugiri place? It's on the way home." "Sort of. I don't know. That's pretty far out of the way," she said, slipping into mother mode before she could stop herself. "Please, it's my first day really learning how to be a shinobi. Uruka-sensei said I was really good at helping him with demonstrations." Good point. Good point, she conceded. Little sneak, he knew perfectly well how much difficulty his mother had saying no to their Akira-filled ones. Nar had turned away from their conversation and resumed his lonely swinging up and down. He was chewing on his lip and trying not to look desperately hungry. She walked over to him and smiled in what she hoped was a loving manner. "Naruto-chan," she said, reluctantly appending the affectionate suffix, "do you like anig?" His face lit up like a festival bonfire at the first spark of her attention, and he scrambled to his feet. "Yeah, I love onigiri. Not as much as I love ramen, but I don't really love anything as much as I love ramen. And anyways, I will definitely come eat on onigiri with you and Sasaki whenever you want. What's your name? Where are we going? Do you live in the really nice house on the edge of town? Sasaki says you do, but your family must be really big to fill up that big house." My house isn't very big at all, so I thought. She held up a hand to dam the rush of words, which had absolutely no effect. Nar, she said, and then repeated herself louder. He finally shut his mouth with a little pop. My name is Uchiha Mikoto and you can call me Mikoto Obasan. We're going to a restaurant that Sasaki and I like very much. Our house is pretty big and I do my best to make sure it looks nice. She began as her brain finished processing the rush of questions. Your house. You don't live by yourself, do you? Yeah, sort of. I do, he replied. Stuff kept happening to me at the orphanage that I didn't like at all. And the ladies there kept making out that it was my fault, which was stupid because why would I do things like set my own shirt on fire while I was wearing it? And so finally, the old man let me move into my own apartment. The landl does my laundry and stuff, but I think she needs to see a doctor for her head because she forgets an awful lot. I heard that happens when you get old, but she isn't that wrinkly yet. I hope she's not sick. Mikoto let his rambling wash over her, growing more and more horrified with every innocent word. Her conflict over his containing the thing that slaughtered her family faded away before the fact that someone deliberately attempted to set a little boy on fire. It had to get bad enough that an attempt to maim him, maybe even kill him, was what it took to get Nar out of the public orphanage. Aside from mild malnourishment, she didn't see any physical signs of injury. But that didn't mean it wasn't happening. Kush's bruises from their sparring sessions had faded in hours, and even a broken leg hadn't kept her from running laps for more than a couple of weeks. At the time, she claimed it was an ability of the Uzumaki clan. But Mikoto now suspected it had more to do with her secret house guest than her parentage. Even in the grip of her own smoldering hatred of the Kyuubi, she didn't think she could bring herself to physically harm its young jailer, especially since he turned out to be so ingenuously adorable. She'd only known Naruto for a few minutes, and her history with his prisoner aside, had cautiously decided she liked him. She swallowed back the bitter anger at his nameless assailant, and her own feeling of negligence in the matter, and took one small, dirty hand in hers. She would make this up to Kosa. She would. Mikoto went to bed that night feeling more than a little queasy with guilt. When she and the boys walked into the small restaurant, the proprietor hadn't been able to fully mask his sneer at the sight of Naruto clinging to her hand. The service she and Sasaki received was as pleasant as usual, but somehow the waiter tripped and almost poured scalding hot tea all over the back of Naruto's head. Only Mikoto's shinobi reflexes had kept the tray level and saved him from a very nasty burn. Later, when Sasaki asked to try a bite of one of Naruto's onigiri, he discovered the ones the other boy received were packed with dry, burnt-tasting rice on the inside compared to the moist ones on his own plate. The service for the table as a whole only improved when Mikoto murmured to Sasaki, well within their waiter's earshot, that the standards here had really slipped and she'd be telling everyone she knew to avoid the place. Nar didn't seem surprised by any of it, which was depressing. Did he receive this treatment from everyone? No wonder he seemed so uncomfortable sitting at their table. His manners were not poor so much as non-existent, but she could tell he was trying his very best to sit still and behave in the best way he knew how. He spent the whole of the small meal watching Sasaki like he had a sharing of his own, aping his every gesture, as if he could absorb years of etiquette training in half an hour. Nar turned out to be an extremely energetic child, but he heeded her gentle corrections to speak more quietly and stopped kicking the table with gratifying determination. At 6, he already had a reputation as an audacious prankster and hellion in the making. But he wasn't a bad kid. In terms of his intentions, if not his impulsive actions, she would even go so far as to rate him better than most. He seemed to genuinely care what other people thought about him and was desperately eager to please if given the chance. What struck her most was his concern for the well-being of people who clearly had none for his. In particular, the garbled story of the borderline abusive caretaker that lived down the hall made her furious on his behalf. Apparently, she would forget to bring him the home-cooked meals the Hokage was paying her to prepare, and Naruto would have to dig into his meager pocket money for convenience store ramen cups to fill his empty belly. Mikoto decided to start preparing an extra bento every school day and stowing it nonchalantly in Sasaki's book bag for the foreseeable future. She turned restlessly in the large bed and wished desperately for someone to talk to. Fugaku was working a difficult case this week and would probably end up catching whatever sleep he could on the futon he kept in his office closet. She scowled up at the ceiling. Having another warm body in the bed was comforting in a small way, but it wasn't like she could talk to him about something like this anyway. Her Uchiha friends wouldn't do either. To a woman, all of them considered her friendship with Kusha a topic to be avoided like the discussion of an embarrassing rash. Their Jonin instructor had held an unassuming affection for both of them and would have been ideal. But Hideki Sakumo had been dead by his own hand for a decade. Yui Desiro, the last of her old Janine trio, was still among the living to the best of her knowledge. But he was leading a long-term mission in the land of lightning and was so unreachable he could be living on the moon. Save herself as a 7 hours ago, the Hokage was the only other person she was aware of that took an active, if limited, interest in Naruto's continued well-being. But he was so busy, it would be weeks before it was brought to his attention. And even if it was, there was no guarantee he could change things. Konoha was the most democratic of the ninja villages, and that meant the Hokage had no right to give the civilians direct orders unless their actions were directly threatening the village's integrity. She didn't think the mistreatment of one small boy was going to make the cut. Mikoto was a naturally companionable person and had cultivated a long list of friends. It was a sucker punch to discover all the ones she could really count on were either dead or so far away they might as well be. All the loneliness she'd been trying to push away since she awoke that morning came crashing down like the waters of a breaking dam. Mikoto's eyes began to burn with tears. She ground her fists into the sheets and tried to force them down. Why didn't you check on him? Her conscience screamed at her in Kasha's most outraged voice. You didn't even go to see him once. You left that up to Desiro when he'd just been accepted into Anbu and didn't have time to babysit. And we both know Kakashi was too much of a wreck after the QB killed Minato and Ren. You called yourself a shinobi when you were scared of a baby. You're nothing but a pretty little coward. I had my own responsibilities, she whispered to the empty air. I had a newborn of my own. The southern clan compound was almost leveled, and half the Uchiha were homeless. There was so little time, right, the inner voice scoffed. You always were the responsible one, picking up the slack for me all the damn time, even when I didn't want you to. I'm sorry I was so busy being dead, I couldn't pull my own weight the one time I really needed your help. Mikoto hadn't cried for years since the night of the memorial before that mountain of a grave. But tonight, she turned her face into her pillow and lost her battle against the straining tears. I'll do better, Kusha, she whispered between stifled sobs. From now on, I'll do better. The next morning, Mikoto was back to her usual placid self. Although Itachi kept drifting odd looks in her direction over breakfast, they weren't compassionate looks, just odd, like he'd been completely aware of the noise, but didn't care enough to ask why his mother had been sobbing alone in her bedroom. He'd been like that practically his whole life, never cruel, just cold. Mikoto told herself for the millionth time that it shouldn't bother her, that it was how Itachi was, and then for the millionth time failed to heed her own advice. She packed the boys off to their respective commitments. Sasaki to school and Itachi off to a short-term mission and had the house to herself again. This time around, she knew better than to loaf around in it and drive herself crazy. Now that her head had been cleared by a good night's rest, she realized that she wasn't as alone as she thought. Her first and only genin team was completely intact. Isuki Yuga, Gekko Haruka, and Kamida Ishimaru. She had spent so long thinking of them as the goofy kids they briefly were. She didn't feel comfortable broaching a subject of this nature, but that wasn't being fair. All of them were adults now, sneaking into their mid-20s. Unlike a lot of Jonin instructors, she had kept up good relationships with all of them, even if she didn't have the chance to see them as often as she would have liked. Quite a few of her former peers were more Jonin than sensei and taught only under duress because there weren't enough warm bodies to distribute to the rookie teams. Those genin always seemed itchy to pass the Chunin exams for no other reason than to be rid of their crazy teachers. Mikoto had worked her team very hard, managing to manhandle all three to the final round of the exams on their second try, and had seen two of those pass on that exam and the third on the one 6 months later. She was pretty sure they all hated her guts for months after that second attempt. But like good little ninja, in time they managed to see underneath the sadistic training sessions to the genuine love she had for them. She worked them so hard as genin so they'd be strong enough to survive, even thrive as chunin and beyond. All of them had thanked her for that hellish month at one time or another with identical rice smiles on their faces. Ishimaru was the most sensitive of the lot and was also a bit older since he'd stayed in school 2 extra years to be trained as a medic before being promoted to genin. He was also the child of civilian parents who had made their home on a farm kilometers out from Konoha and consequently had lost the lease to the QB. Better yet, his apartment was plausibly closer to favorite clothing boutiques so she could drop by without feeling like a total fool. She changed out of her house dress into a loose tunic and calf-length pants and gave her hair a cursory brushing before stepping out the door. Fugaku didn't like to see her wearing pants, preferring the feminine grace of an old-fashioned kimono, but the old grouch wasn't around to see, was he? It was another lovely summer day, and Mikoto took her time browsing through the open-air shops on her way to Ishimaru's building. The chief of police pulled in a tidy sum every year, so her face was a welcome one to the shopkeepers. She collected a few odds and ends she didn't realize she needed and some new formal heeled sandals since her old ones were becoming too scuffed for shoe polish to salvage. So burdened, she let herself in through the unlocked back gate and knocked briskly on Ishimaru's door. She could hear someone closing drawers in a hurry. Good, he was home. Ishimaru was not the one to answer the door. It was his lover Yamashiro Aoba, and the Tunin was missing both his trademark sunglasses and his air of affability. He had a backpack stuffed with clothes hanging from one hand and for some reason was clutching what she assumed to be Ishimaru's toothbrush in the other. Mikoto-sensei, he said stupidly. Ishimaru's not here. They got bad intel. They weren't bandits. They were all shinobi and I'm going to visit him now if the medics will let me. The handle of Mikoto's shopping bag slipped through her fingers and a small bottle of perfume smashed on the concrete landing. Normally, that news would not induce the kind of panic in a shinobi she saw written all over his face, but Ishimaru's rookie team was an unusual unit made up entirely of medics in training. Though they were taught to handle themselves in a fight, their primary purpose was search and rescue or support of heavy combat teams. They were not sent alone on missions where fighting more intense than a few scuffles with civilians was expected. She was too polite to say it to him aloud, but someone at the mission office had seriously up. She didn't blame him for expecting the worst. So did she. How badly was he hurt? She asked softly while Aoba juggled his things around until he found his keys and locked the place up. I don't know. I just learned he was dropped off at the hospital. Do you want to come with me? Absolutely. I'm going to take the roofs. It'll be faster with the lunch rush and everything, so I'll meet. Who said I'm not running the roofs, too? She said, cutting him off. I can leave this stuff here. She prodded the shopping bag with her foot. If you don't mind unlocking the door again and putting my purse into the other pocket of that backpack. He did as she asked and pushed off from the sturdy railing of the stairwell. Mikoto followed as soon as he'd cleared the roof space on the building across the alley. Lucky she decided on pants and flat sandals today. The first couple of landings were less than graceful, but soon the comfortable rhythm of chakra concentration and release in the muscles of her legs returned like she had never left it. They arrived on the roof deck of the hospital after about 15 minutes of rooftop travel. Mikoto found herself embarrassingly out of breath once they reached their destination. But he had other things to worry about and didn't call her out on it. She secured visitors' passes to the burn ward for herself and Aoba, who looked so sick with worry he was afraid to open his mouth in case he threw up on the poor receptionist. Ishimaru was in room 2245. She took a deep breath, preparing herself for something barely recognizable as human. A vision of her brother Kojiro welled up in her head. His handsome face mutilated beyond recognition by the CQ chakra, drugged nearly into insensibility, but somehow still screaming, she forced it away and pushed open the door. She let the breath out in an audible rush when Ishimaru blinked at his new visitors and managed to smile hazily back at them. His round, genial face was toned to sickly gray beneath his tan, and his cinnamon hair still matted slightly with mud, but all in all, he didn't look too bad. She did a quick tally of the limbs hidden by the hospital sheets and came up with the same number he'd owned last time they'd spoken. The relief was so immense her knees momentarily went weak. Yua had beaten them there, and Ishimaru's ducklings were lined up in a neat row near the window, looking battered and grubby, but not seriously injured. The violet-haired Kunoichi nodded to Aoba in greeting, and then to her. He slumped into an empty spot on the bed near Ishimaru's hips and looked over the extensive bandages obscuring his right side. You scared the out of me, he said. What happened? Are you in a lot of pain, Kaden? He wheezed and immediately started coughing. Mikoto picked out the words rogue ninja ambush and gave me the good drugs between the painful spasms. The fit continued for some time, and eventually he gave up trying to speak. The tallest of his genin stood up to fill in the gaps, worrying at the torn cuff of his shirt and not meeting anyone's eyes. He was a Haug boy with light brown hair that fell in a long braid down his back, dressed in the traditional off-white robes favored by the clan. We were supposed to be rendering medical aid to a town caught in that earthquake near the Kusa border. He said they'd had some problems with bandits on top of everything else. So once all our patients were stabilized, Ishimaru-sensei decided to organize a preemptive strike to scare them off before they tried to steal any of our medical supplies. Mikoto nodded. It had been a good idea, at least in theory. Medicines were often more attractive than plunder to someone living outside the law since they were more immediately useful. A show of force by a small group of trained shinobi was often enough to root the less studied troublemakers without bloodshed. And when your team was composed entirely of medics, avoiding any unplanned confrontations was paramount. Except we didn't scare them off, the Haga continued. It turned out one of them was an old war deserter from Konoha and knew he'd be recognized if Ishimaru-sensei got a good look at his face. There were some low-ranking Iowa ninja, too, also deserters. They tricked my Byakugan by setting up a false camp that was hardly guarded, while the rest waited to ambush us out of my visual range. The boy frowned. That's how we knew we were really in trouble. Who else but another shinobi would know the maximum range of a genin's Bakugan right down to the meter? As soon as we reached the middle of the camp, he sighed shamefaced. We got stuck in a Doden jutsu that turned the ground to muck, so we couldn't leap clear. But Ishimaru sensei saved us. One of his other students piped up. A girl with a rather prominent nose and the characteristic Inuzuka facial tattoos. 3 ash-gray puppies were curled up on the floor around her feet. He couldn't knock the guy's hand signs apart before he finished, so he jumped in front of him and whipped out this awesome futon. Futon Yua interrupted skeptically. Ishimaru had Suna blood in him from somewhere, and the wind styles were all the cards he had to play in terms of elemental enjutsu. They were his only long-range jutsu and worse than useless against a Kaiden user. Futon, the girl affirmed. He turned the fire back on the deserters, but he must have been tired from healing all those people since his chakra ran out before the rogue ninjas did. That's how he got burned. The guy from Konoha got one of Sensei's kana right in the eye. And lucky for us, the misfire from the jutsu burned the Iowa shinobi pretty bad, too. She smiled lopsidedly at the Hyuga. Koken did some fast talking about probable survival rates without antibiotics, and they surrendered in exchange for us patching them up a bit. We handed them over to a Kusa team we met on their way back home. They were happy to get the bounty. Not the smartest thing you've ever done, Mikoto said, shaking her head as she addressed Ishimaru, but it worked. He shakily raised his uninjured arm and gave her a thumbs up. Ishimaru was good at seeing the bright side in any situation. The narcotics probably helped. It could have been worse, the first genin said, looking guilty down at his incapacitated and drug-adult teacher. Much worse, the third added, joining the conversation for the first time from behind his high-collared coat. Must have been an aborum. He neglected to remove it even in the pleasant summer warmth. I already spoke with his physician, Yuga put in. He's going to be on the injured list for a while, but the damage is mostly cosmetic, and his movement and breathing shouldn't be permanently impaired. Her stern gaze softened as it swept over his students. He also mentioned that you 3 did an excellent job of taking care of him on the way back to Konoha. If you'd let an infection take hold so far from real medical facilities, he probably would have died. Mikoto shifted her weight against the wall and smiled to herself. She felt less like a mother and more like a team captain than she had in a long time and in the best of all possible ways. She was proud as hell of Ishimaru, who in his genin days had been far and away the most timid of the team. It seemed her student had picked up a few tricks of his own after she'd set him loose and had in turn passed them on to his own students. When the master-student cycle worked, this was what could be accomplished. She wasn't an adherent of the will of fire philosophy and related Sinu inspirational rubbish. She was too loyal and Uchiha for that. But some days she almost wanted to admit her clan's ancient rivals had a point. Aoba Cid led closer to his injured lover and glanced at her knowingly. Mikoto could take a hint. She stood up straighter and crossed her arms over her chest. Ishimaru needs his rest, she said, her tone making it an order. Why don't we all get going? I'm sure he'll be up for a visit tomorrow. The favor she'd come to his apartment to ask would have to wait. Even if he was emotionally steady enough to shore her up, his throat and lungs were too badly damaged for him to speak properly. Still, even though he'd barely said 5 intelligible words to her, for some reason, she felt a little better. She'd screwed up royally with little Nar. But as a mentor, she'd come through for Ishimaru. Nar wasn't even 7 yet. She had time to correct her past neglect. Everyone save Aoba filed out herself and Yuga last. Has Haruka come by? Mikoto asked idly. Yuga shook her head. I stopped by her apartment on the way here, but she's down south. Probably won't be back in the village for a few days. I left her a note. They walked to the elevators in companionable silence, and when they reached them, Yuga paused with her hand on the call button. Excuse me, sensei, she said. But I have a favor to ask you. Sasuke has started school by now, hasn't he? Then I was wondering. Would you be able to take over training Ishimaru's team for a while? The next round of Chunin exams are a little over a month away. I would pitch in myself, but my mission schedule might be getting very full very quickly, she said, absently rubbing a spot on her right deltoid. I'm sure the Hokage will recognize your abilities, Mikoto said warmly, keeping her reply equally ambiguous. Yugao had expressed an interest in applying for Andu the last time they'd spoken. She must have been invited to participate in the tryouts. Despite the unspoken prejudice against Kunoichi from the ranks as a whole with her skills, Mikoto didn't think a place on the elite squad was out of her reach. Like herself, Yuga was a ninja that fought primarily with her head instead of her fists. A master of traps and ambushes. In an ambu operative serving during peacetime, subtlety and stealth were often more valuable than flashy enjutsu or the strength to crush rocks in your teeth. Before her marriage was arranged, her old teammate, Desiro, had urged Mikoto to try out herself. If she'd gotten in, it would have made her one of the first female members in history. But that was one goal her future father-in-law had managed to shoot out of the sky. She wanted Yuga to make it and succeed where she had faltered. That boys' club needs a little shaking up, she added tartly. Thank you, her student said softly with a small nod and a smile, and returned to the subject at hand. The other instructors will be adding the kids to teams as they see fit, so you wouldn't have to go with them on missions. This is strictly informal tutoring. Well, I would have the time, but I'm so far out of fighting trim, it's not even funny. Would they even consent to being trained by a housewife? If someone gave that option to me as a Jenna, I would have thought it was a bad joke. A twinkle of amusement appeared in the younger woman's eyes. Considering how well you managed to beat their sensei into shape for his exams, I think they might if that housewife was you. True enough, I'll definitely think about it and let you know no later than the end of the week. Ooh, her answer would have been an unequivocal yes, but she wasn't sure how Fugaku would take it. She'd really enjoyed teaching, and being presented with a no-strings-attached opportunity to return was perfect. But tutoring the three genin was skirting dangerously close to unretiring as a jonin. And there were few things her husband disliked more than being reminded his wife probably had the potential to become a better shinobi than he was. She pondered how best to approach the delicate topic for the rest of the day. Mikoto could charm her way into almost anyone's good graces, a talent that had served her well in her brief career as an infiltration specialist and possibly even more so as wife of the chief of police. Despite her status, people let their guard down around her. The wives of his detectives confided things in her. Their husbands would never dream of telling Fugaku. She cultivated her plot of informants with frequent invitations to tea and charity luncheons, and it rarely failed her. She tapped her sources, assembled a plan of attack, and after careful preparation, broached the subject at dinner. Have you made any progress with your case? She asked over his favorite dish of hearty beef yakisoba. She already knew the answer to this question. Otherwise, she wouldn't have asked. He was always testy if he felt like a case was stagnating and sometimes took it out on her if she was dumb enough to give him the opening. The secretaries at the headquarters were notorious gossips, occasionally irritating when she was the subject of their whispers, but such a valuable source of information about the state of village politics, she always forgave them. We have finally, he said, sounding immensely pleased with himself. The Kiri spy was stubborn as they come and somehow warded against the more basic mind probes, but Inoichi-san cracked the seal this morning. We should have a list of his contacts by tomorrow. Sasaki slurped noisily at this noodles. Itachi, as was becoming more frequently the case, was absent. That's really cool, he said. Some of those Kiri ninja are creepy. They do this weird thing to their teeth to make themselves look like sharks. Or maybe they're born like that, which is well, that's even creepier. I'm glad you got him. When I think about one running around our village messing stuff up, he trailed off and shuddered. When I graduate, can I help you with cases like that? Of course you can, his father replied, helping himself to more noodles and not really listening. Sasake's shoulders slumped noticeably. Mikoto was dignified enough not to roll her eyes at the table, but she really wished her husband would stop doing that. In private, he spoke rather highly of Sasuke's abilities when the subject came up, and she knew he loved him on some level, but it wouldn't hurt to let the boy know now and again, and Sasaki was starting to be able to tell when he was being humored. Eventually, he was going to work up the nerve to say something like, when I graduate, can I run off to join a secret organization of S-class rogue ninja with some insane plan to take over the world? And Fugaku was going to give him full permission. Not that he'd ever take his father up on it, but still. That's such a relief, Mikoto gushed. You've been working so hard lately. I feel like I hardly ever see you. With the boys gone all day, too, it's a little lonely. He shook his head. It was a good break, but this is only the beginning. We still don't know how extensive their network is. I don't expect things to settle down for another month at the very least. A month of you out of my hair. Perfect, she thought. Oh, she said sadly externally the picture of the dutiful wife. I see. He put down his chopsticks, looking as apologetic as he ever got. You don't have to stay home all day. Leto-chan help you with the cleaning. We can certainly afford it. Go out and enjoy yourself now that Sasaki is in school. I don't know what I would, she began as if her entire world was confined to dustpans and laundry baskets, then smiled as if a wonderful idea had occurred to her. I know one of my genin team, Ishimaru, remember him? Was badly injured on a mission and is going to be stuck in the hospital for weeks. The timing was just awful with the Tsunade exams coming up and he couldn't find anyone to tutor his team while he's recuperating. I'm so out of practice, but better than nothing. And they're such talented kids. It would be a shame for them to have to wait another 6 months to enter. That's an idea, I suppose. Fugaku said, not entirely pleased, but not openly opposed either. Mikoto could work with that. She was just doing a favor for a bedridden friend out of the goodness of her heart. That it meant pulling her shinobi gear out of the closet was incidental. She picked daintily at her noodles as if patching together a plan in her head. I can work with them while Sasaki is in school, so I'll be home in time to meet him and get dinner on the table. This is going to be the first joint exam since the war broke out, isn't it? He said contemplatively. Konoha will need a stronger showing than usual. Oh, that's right, she said. I'm not 100% sure, but I heard it's in Iowa this time. Iowa, he sneered. A large chunk of the police force had been mobilized near the end of the war, including Fugaku, and he held onto his grudges like a starving wolf. Iowa and Konoha were now officially at peace. But the war was recent enough there was still plenty of bad blood. More than a few of the Konohaganon would be looking for vengeance in the stadium, and the opposite would be true as well. It was expected to be a particularly deadly exam. We need all the strong genin we can get. Go ahead, see what you can do with them. Mikoto thanked him and went back to her bowl, hook, line, and sinker, she thought between delicate bites. Mikoto returned to visit Ishimaru once more that week, and happily reported to him that his genin wouldn't be teacherless for long. He'd taken to communicating with a pad of paper and a stubby pencil while the heat damage to his lungs healed and wrote in very large characters. I almost feel sorry for the little brats, underlining it twice after she related the good news. He was no doubt remembering his first training session after his team committed to the exams for their second time. Haruka and Yuga just about had to carry him home. A few days later, Sasaki found himself shoot out of the door and a rice ball shoved in his mouth at 7:15 in the morning, even though the school was only 15 minutes away. Luckily, he was a naturally early riser and too bewildered to protest the disruption in routine. Besides, it gave him more time to sweep for Naruto's traps before the first bell rang. Her temporary team were to meet her at training ground 3 at 8 sharp, and Mikoto needed time to prepare. Their first session together was primarily so she could feel out their strengths and weaknesses and tailor her lessons accordingly. That and make sure they knew very well how dangerous this delicate flower of the home could be if she so chose. Yuga might have warned them how strict she could be and they might behave, but she had the feeling she was going to have to put her foot down very hard on some genin toes this morning. She would have preferred the opportunity to build up a bit of camaraderie before putting them through the ringer, but there wasn't time. She was more than a little apprehensive about the home team competition. The hosting village always fielded far more candidates than the visitors. The kids were going to need some toughening up before they were ready to go up against young Iowa Ninja with their parents' scores to settle. To make it even worse, the exams were undeniably stacked against medical specialists. Such teams often split up for the purposes of the test, attaching themselves to incomplete combat-focused groups who'd had a member promoted. Team 2 had already decided they'd be testing together. Yes, they were going to need her help and they weren't going to like it. In the long run, it didn't matter if they thought she was as sadistic as some of the career torturers in Ambuti and I. As long as they didn't come back from Iwagakure in body bags. Mikoto edged into the bedroom closet and pulled out a battered, very heavy box from the bottom of a stack. She sneezed once at the dust she disturbed and opened it. One by one, she laid the contents out on her bed and began to undress. She picked up the male shirt, considered the weight and the ambient temperature, and pulled it on. She didn't expect her young charges to be very accurate with their projectiles, but a beginner's wild throws could be dangerous, primarily because they were so unpredictable. She shook out the high-collared gray shirt, frowning at the loose threads attaching the Uchiha emblem to the right sleeve. She'd meant to mend that really 6 years ago. The patch she pulled off completely and tossed back in the box so it wouldn't come loose and get lost. The black leggings still fit if she did a funny thing with her abdominal muscles and didn't breathe in too hard. Her hair she twirled up in a bun and secured with a square of cloth tightened by a cord to keep it out of her face. Finally, she shrugged on her collarless flak jacket and buckled on the pouches for her throwing weapons. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror. The gentle wife and mother had disappeared, and a severe L-looking kunoichi had taken her place. With her hair pulled back and the familiar weight of her shuriken on her hip, she felt herself standing straighter, unwilling to cast her eyes down as a proper Uchiha woman should. She buckled on her high open-toed boots and long gloves and left through the window instead of the door, although she doubted she'd be recognized dressed as she was. She took the roofs and then the trees to the training field, purposely arriving early to give herself time to catch her breath. Her new students could never be allowed to see how out of shape she was. It was beyond embarrassing. Her younger self could have kept such a pace going for hours, but after the births of 2 children, her dedication to her old training routine had lapsed to understate things. Although there was no particular reason she couldn't take it up again, as long as she started slowly, she had the time, and as she discovered after a brief moment of consideration, the will. After an absence of years, Mikoto felt that old yearning to be able to prove herself on the field, to test her limits against another's and find herself victorious. The first of her students arrived in the clearing before she could ponder too closely who she wanted to prove herself to. It was Hyuga first, followed a few seconds later by the other 2, Inuzuka Hana, plus 3 quarreling puppies and Aram Shmez and taking up the rear. She'd stopped by the records office yesterday and requested their personnel files and a couple of C-ranked mission reports to skim over. On paper, they seemed like a very promising team. Ko was the surgeon and rising star. Hyuga medics were highly sought after in the medical corps since one of them was practically a walking surgical theater all by themselves. They could diagnose fractures or internal injuries with complete precision under the most rugged field conditions and perform bloodless, delicate surgery without the need for the scopes and incisions other physicians relied upon. The other 2 weren't prodigies, but far from a burden. Hana was training as a veterinarian, which was going to win her a lot of friends among all the Ninkin contracted with Konoha's shinobi. And her own companions would be invaluable on missions that required tracking down an incapacitated ally whose exact location was unknown. Shame was just as intriguing. Even she had heard of the techniques pioneered by his world-renowned mother, a woman who possessed a very unusual colony of Kikachu specializing in the analysis and production of various chemicals. If he was anywhere near as proficient in his use of the insects, it would allow him to manufacture a wide array of drugs almost at will. Mikoto-sensei, Ko said, putting a sneer into the honorific. Good morning. Good morning. The other 2 chorused slightly more politely. They followed his lead willingly. It seemed if she asserted her authority over him, the other 2 would probably fall into line. His blank white eyes were defiant, scanning probable strength and skill even without his Bakugan active. He did not look impressed with what he found. That was fine with her. If he wanted to be so foolish as to judge her abilities based on her looks, he was welcome. She'd have that beaten out of him soon enough. It wasn't a conceit a Chunin could afford. His contempt would be almost funny if she wasn't aware of the extenuating circumstances. She didn't know him well yet, but she guessed that most of his current swagger was fine. He had looked much more like a frightened child when she saw him hovering near his sensei's hospital bed last week. He seemed unusually attached to Ishimaru, given his status in the clan. His home life was probably ugly right now. The business with the attempted kidnapping of Hyuga Hinata by Kumo had recently been resolved, but at the cost of a branch house member's life. It must have been a severe blow to learn how little your own clan valued the life of one member over another when they were separated only by an accident of birth. The boy was currently acting very Unchan-like, but she still wanted him to pass. According to Ishimaru, he was the most promising young medic the Corps had seen in decades, and he could do a tremendous amount of good once he was able to operate on his own. In Ishimaru's absence, it would be her job to ensure he didn't get his skinny neck broken in the exams before his talents could come to fruition. The other 2, her student had confided, needed more polish on their tactics before they were really contenders for a promotion. But participating would be a good experience for them. Provided they were proficient enough to survive it. Good morning, ducklings, she replied cheerfully. Do you mind if I call you ducklings? Yes, Ko stonily, looking at her like she was insane. The other 2 exchanged glances, confirming their young leader's unspoken assessment. I thought we could start off with a little exercise to see how far along your offensive skills are, she said, continuing like she hadn't even heard his objection and rooted around in a vest pocket for 3 scraps of paper. On these are 3 tracking seals, the children to the parent seal I have on my palm. She held her left hand up and sent a brief pulse of chakra through it to illuminate the design through the fabric of her gloves. To activate them, prick a finger and dab it in the center. The seal will transfer from the paper to your bodies. The objective is for at least one of you to get close enough to touch Ma Bear's skin with that finger for the full 5 seconds it takes to transfer the child seal back to its parent. You have until 2 o'clock. I have to be home before my son gets back from school. Are you ready? They all nodded. By the way, this is a live weapons exercise. If you don't come at me with the intent to kill, you'll lose. And next time I see Ishimaru, I'll have to tell him you were beaten by some housewife who hasn't been on a real mission in a decade. Begin. You're wearing gloves. Shame pointed out unnecessarily. How are we supposed to? At her inspoken signal, one of Hannah's puppies took the initiative and lunged at her ankle. There was a small puff of smoke and a shower of branches, and it fell on its rump with a stick in its teeth. Mikoto resisted the urge to coo from her perch in the trees above their heads. Ninken just hated that. She targeted Ko with her first genjutsu right as he predictably activated his Bakugan, bathing his panoramic vision in light so intense he could be staring into the sun from every direction. He could theoretically see through the illusion, but instinct took over before he could make the effort. He screamed, clapped his hands over his face, and deactivated the dujutsu. As an afterthought, she tossed out an area illusion of the overpowering scent of cheap perfume to take care of Hana and her dogs. The clearing soon echoed with a chorus of puppy sneezes and vivid cursing. A quick glance confirmed Shimezen was too preoccupied with his fallen leader to go after her. That was disappointing. A lack of initiative robbed their team of a good opportunity. Akikao colony's collective mind was too alien for her genjutsu to affect it. So he was the best equipped to go after an illusionist like herself. She took advantage of their preoccupation to disappear into the trees. 3 rookie genin versus 1 very out of shape. John, the game was on. Ooh. It was another 4 hours before she let them actually see her again. Having lead them on an erratic and frustrating chase through the forested training ground. Whenever their leader tried to pinpoint her location with his Bakugan, she'd blind him again. After a couple more tries, he gave up. She got more creative with Hana, throwing out in succession the smell of barbecue, kerosene, pine resin, and decomposing fish. Shame ought to have tagged her with a kikai already, and short of stripping, she'd probably never be able to pick it off. But he was letting the other 2 lead the way. If he didn't build up confidence in his tracking abilities, he was never going to get anywhere. She dusted off half a dozen of her old tricks during the leisurely pursuit. Nothing worse than what she'd originally done to Ko, but damned annoying all the same. There was the classic covered in bugs illusion, which had Hana ready to strangle an offended Shimezen before Ko intervened. An area illusion that moved the stream running through the grounds a step to the north and drenched them all in freezing water. And another that transformed a massive berry bramble into what looked like a lovely clearing to stop and have a ration bar. While it was true genjutsu could do no physical harm, the goal of the art was to make opponents so frightened, angry, or disoriented they committed a fatal error or to immobilize them so they could be captured alive. A spray of ice could seem to lock their limbs in place. The lip of a cliff could appear to extend a step past its true end. An array of exploding tags could be completely concealed in bare ground. Despite her relative restraint, by the time they did finally catch a glimpse of her, all 3 genin were ready to chew bricks. If they had begun this exercise with any reservations about punching a housewife in the face, they'd melted away by now. Having fun, kids? She asked with more of that sadistic cheer after finally letting Hana pick up her trail and corner her against the cliff face. All of them glared. She could feel it even behind Shmin's sunglasses. There was a point to this torment. Their teamwork looked good on the surface, but she wanted to see if they held together under pressure without Ishimaru there to fill in the cracks. The Chunin exams always included some kind of mission simulation, and it was absolutely imperative the 3 of them stick together for the duration of that stage. They were going to be hungry, sleep-deprived, possibly injured, and heartily sick of each other's company. But under no circumstances could they allow their teamwork to falter. Unlike some teams, which included a heavy hitter who could dispatch multiple opponents solo, these 3 would have to work together very closely to keep from being picked off by teams with more firepower. They had performed adequately in that regard, at least, and thanks to their clans, respective skills were nearly impossible to ambush. But she was very worried that none of them seemed to be formulating a strategy for taking her down. They would have to plan very carefully, bluff their little heads off, cut deals, and in general be far more devious than they'd acted so far in order to clear the survival stage. They didn't seem to be getting anywhere, and she needed to see how they fought. Maybe it was time to give them a shove. She targeted Shimezen first, guessing from his reticence that he was the least skilled short-range fighter. Ko sensed her intent and leapt between her and her intended target, sliding into a juken stance as Shmin scrambled hastily out of the way. The smaller boy was perfectly ready to defend himself too and looked more surprised than herself at Ko's interference. Mikoto slid around his blows without much effort, using her sharing to memorize his sloppy forms for later critique. Even she could tell he'd sacrificed quite a few hours in the practice ring for more time in the library. By Hyuga standards, he must be an embarrassment. The way he leapt into cover his friend was one half sweet and one half pathetic. She played with him for a few more moments, taking mental notes before removing him from the fight with a stunning blow just below his sternum. She tossed him aside, coughing and gasping, but not seriously hurt. Hana let out a cry of distress and charged her. She was a fairly tall, sturdy girl. The corded muscle in her bare arms testament to her more balanced approach to physical and mental training. She was surprisingly fast and filled with the controlled chaos of the Inuzuka style of taijutsu. They went back and forth for a while, her opinion of the girl's physical skills rising. Only Mikoto's crimson eyes warned her of a sudden gathering of energy in Hana's fingers before a chakra scalpel buzzed into existence, extending her reach by half a very, very sharp hand. Without her sharing, Hana might even have been able to score a hit if she was lucky, and Mikoto was not. With the Sharingan, it was not a contest. Mikoto twisted away from the bluish chakra blade and caught the girl's wrist in an agonizing hold that shattered her concentration. The deadly glow faded. It had been a decent effort, and a second or two in the right place was more than enough time to sever a tendon or major artery. The chakra scalpel required such sustained concentration, it was difficult to use in a melee. But employed by a skilled and experienced medic, it gave a tremendous advantage in unarmed combat. The man who took over the medical corps after Tsunade-sama left the village was reputed to be unrivaled in its use. Mikoto disappeared in an illusory swirl of leaves to give the genin time to nurse their bruises while she got her breath back from farther down the cliff wall. She dispatched a shadow clone to watch them while she found a nice sun-warmed rock to have some water and a few handful of trail mix. She was dusting the salt from her hands when the clone's memories flooded in. It made her dizzy for a moment. Shadow clones were extremely useful, and she had the chakra reserves to create 24 before tiring herself out. But even when she was still on active duty, she'd never gotten any more comfortable with that sensation. Eyes closed but ears open, she sifted through the memories, attempting to settle themselves in her brain. It looked like the earlier illusory bugs in the bra incident she'd orchestrated between Hana and Shimezen reopened an old wound. And despite Ko's diplomatic efforts, the Arame had stalked off in a huff. It was the stupidest thing he could possibly have done. Too stupid for a genin with as much field experience as Shmin had. She had yet to meet the Aberame that didn't value both logical actions and group cohesion above nearly all else. And the tantrum went violently against character for one of them. He was probably setting himself out on a bait hook so the others could ambush her. She'd take it. It wasn't as though she had anything else to do, and they needed to be taught that such a transparent ploy wasn't going to make the cut for a tunin. She didn't bother masking her presence with an illusion. If he was smart, he'd tagged her before the exercise even began, and his scouts would be able to locate her, even if their host couldn't. He was muttering inconsiderate and probably untrue things about Hana as he walked, hands in the pockets of his long coat, and pretending he didn't know she was there. 5 chakra signatures were creeping up ever so stealthily from behind her. They were masked passably well, and another genin wouldn't have been able to sense them, even the dogs, which was impressive. She listened for a few moments, debating what to do with him when she heard, "Not fair. No way sensei's sensei could be this much of a underscore, now that was too much." Her hands flowed through the signs for the Shunshin Jutsu, and suddenly she was behind him. It wasn't the best one she'd ever pulled off. She infused the technique with far too much chakra, and her vision went black for a split second. She covered her stumble by bringing her hands down hard on his bony shoulders. "Care to repeat that?" she said sweetly into his ear. He shrieked, and his surprise, at least, was not fainted. A small swarm of insects boiled out of his sleeves, but they didn't attack her. Aside from a few nips, they barely siphoned off anything from her large chakra reserves. All they were doing was zipping about in a panic. Sheen seemed to be having trouble controlling them. She wondered absently whether it was the Abaram equivalent of wetting one's pants in fright. He was so preoccupied with his disobedient allies, he didn't even have the presence of mind to attempt to grab her, even though she held no weapons. Disappointing, she released him and vaulted away as a snarling Hana dropped from the trees into the space she had recently occupied, right into the cloud of beetles. She started to cough violently and was replaced by a puff of smoke and a choking puppy with a mouthful of bugs. Another 2 rushed her from either side, cracking twigs as they went in an attempt to pin her where she'd landed. They was substantial. That would be more of her Jujun Bunshin. Then Mikoto executed a second and more elegant Shunshin. The 2 Hana collided with simultaneous pained yips as the last attacked in tandem with Ko, who had finally revealed himself, trying to overwhelm her with wild blows, while the Hyuga snuck in a single disabling hit. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Shamin scuttle off into the bushes. She knocked them both on their backsides and leapt to a narrow ledge on the cliff, then clear over their heads and back into the tree cover where Shimeme-san had retreated. He had hidden himself from her eyes, but her sensory abilities were too sharp for his chakra to likewise disappear. Was he planning something, or was he running scared? Her eyes caught another Shizen in front of her, imperfectly hidden in a tree slightly to her left. The chakra she could see was a heaving buzzing mass of very weak signatures. He didn't even know better than to use a Kiki Bunchon against a Sharingan. The tactics definitely needed work. Her hands formed the single sign she required for a weak but long-ranged and very accurate. Kaden, she drew in a sharp breath and spat the spear of flame at the clone, which exploded into its constituent bugs at the last instant. The ones at the center were too slow to avoid it and burned to ashes. The real Shimazan jumped away in a rustle of leaves, his weak ruse destroyed. She followed him into the tree branches and drew out some shuriken, aiming to frighten him rather than cause any real injuries. He dodged all but one, which clipped him in the calf. His control broke just as his foot made contact with the bark, and with the anchoring chakra disrupted, he slipped forward and smacked his face into a low branch before he could catch himself. He grunted in pain and fell to the forest floor, blood streaming from his nose and the cuts around his eyes where the frame of his glasses had broken. That she hadn't intended. But she couldn't very well rush to his side and start fussing over it, even if the motherly side of her wanted to. He was a medic. If he'd injured himself in the barely controlled fall, he could perform his own first aid. And on the field, he'd have to do so whether or not he was in pain. She withdrew to plan her next action, leaning against the mossy trunk of a downed tree. The genin had wasted more than 4.5 hours chasing her with nothing to show for it. None of them had managed to touch her for even a full second, never mind 5. She was beginning to doubt Ishimaru's assurances that his team was ready for this exam. He'd always been a soft touch, and in a shinobi, this was not a desirable personality trait. If he hadn't turned out to be such a skilled healer, which mostly kept him out of combat situations, he would have washed out long ago. Had his team pestered him into allowing them to compete together? Had he done so against his better judgment, to be nice? Mikoto scowled into the trees. She expected better from a Jonin she herself had trained. Unlike some, she did believe there was a place for kindness in a shinobi's life. But if it increased the chances your teammates would be injured or killed, it was in the wrong place. She levered herself up from her seat and then fell back with an undignified half-stumble when a wave of dizziness crashed over her. Mikoto shook her head to clear it. That was odd. She shouldn't have this much trouble catching her breath either. Her heart was still hammering like she'd just finished a lap around the village walls, and her meager lunch was churning in her stomach. She gave herself a few minutes of rest before moving again, but the tightness in her chest didn't go away. It felt, if anything, even worse. She got to her feet again, despite the uncomfortable sensation, and staggered when the forest around her began spinning alarmingly. Definitely poisoned, she thought, as the ground pitched and tossed her to her hands and knees. Several things began to make sense all at once. And despite how ill she was starting to feel, she smiled. She hadn't even noticed Shimemasan plant the inventor Kikau, and she really had walked right into their ambush within an ambush. It didn't mention in his dossier that his specialized colony could manufacture poisons, only medicines, but even drugs one purchased off the shelf at the pharmacy could be dangerous in large doses or if mixed with other incompatible chemicals. They hadn't been trying very hard to disable her in combat because they had been planning on doing so using their medical knowledge, and there was no sense in wasting strength they had to conserve very carefully. She wouldn't be surprised to discover at least some of Ko and Shmin's incompetence in taijutsu was an act intended to lull her into overconfidence. Using the limited resources at their disposal, they had concocted and executed a rather clever plan. Turned one of her favorite weapons against her. In fact, poison could be time-consuming to prepare and dangerous for the clumsy, but for someone as physically weak as she was, it was one of the best ways to even out a fight. And it worked hand in hand with her genjutsu. Even something as innocuous as a few cups of sake significantly increased susceptibility to illusion, and she knew how to concoct hallucinogens so powerful even another Uchiha would no longer be able to distinguish fantasy from reality. Whatever Shimazan had whipped up wasn't quite to that caliber, but it had frayed her powers of perception considerably. Slumped over in the moss, she barely even sensed it before one of Hana's dogs strolled out from the underbrush. Not feeling so good, huh? It said smugly in a squeaky voice. Ko-Anasan told me to tell you that you're going to start experiencing a what was it again. It paused to worry its jaw with a hind leg in a charming canine approximation of a head scratch. Oh, right. Tachycardia, convulsions, and death. Unless you let us give you the antidote in under an hour. We're all hanging out by the training dummy with no head. But you probably knew that already. Bye. It bounded off into the ground cover without waiting for an answer. Make her come to them in the state she was in. She couldn't say she didn't deserve it. She pulled herself to her feet and began weaving her way towards her soon-to-be victorious team. She was almost certain they were bluffing about the convulsions and death part, but not certain enough to bet her life on it. Drug overdoses could turn very ugly very fast, and she'd already gotten what she wanted from this startlingly crafty batch of genin. When she staggered to the clearing holding the battered dummies, she found Ko sitting cross-legged on the grass across from Shimemasan, one hand glowing gently green as he tended to the other boy's broken nose. The front of his coat was covered in blood, but he no longer seemed to be in pain. I surrender, she panted, half collapsing against the trunk of a convenient tree. Intent on his work, Ko didn't even turn to look at her. Hana, he ordered. She rose from her place on a stump and approached Mikoto, drawing a kunai just in case. Hana pushed up Mikoto's sleeve and pressed 2 fingers against her bare arm until the seal unlaced itself and flowed back to its parent. Ko scrubbed his fingers clean on the grass and finally looked at her. There is no antidote, if you're wondering, he said, not sounding nearly as pleased with himself as she felt he had the right to be. The shortness of breath and nausea will go away by themselves in an hour or 2. May we go? Not yet, she said. Sit down. She didn't feel too bad as long as she remembered to breathe at a reasonable pace and kept her head steady. Hana sat without any back talk. Shine rotated to look her, squinting without his glasses. All of you, good work, she said. Ishimaru told me you were a talented team. I had my doubts, but you've proven him right. The others looked confused and co-insulted. You spent the entire time playing with us. If this had been a real mission, you could have killed us 100 times over. All we did was get in each other's way and trip over our own feet. He looked away, his jaw clenched. Well, this wasn't a real mission, and teaching you how not to trip over your own feet is why I'm here. I'll see you tomorrow at 8, she said. We'll be beginning weight training. Wear your chain mail if you have it. Thank you for your time, Mikoto. Sensei, Ko said stiffly, rising to his feet. But that won't be necessary. I will not be entering the exams this year or any year. Hana Schmezen. My apologies. He shouldered his bag and began to walk away. There was a moment of dumbfounded silence. What? Hana burst out, whipping around. Are you nuts? You can't quit. Can't we talk about? Ko didn't turn around. I have to go. Hyuga-sama is expecting me. You're not thinking rationally, Shmin said, rising quietly and taking a few steps after him. Without you, our team is incomplete. You can replace me, Ko said over his shoulder. No, she answered. I don't think we can. Ko ignored him and resumed walking. Koken, Mikoto said, come here and sit down. That's an order. For a moment, she was afraid he wasn't going to stop, and she wasn't in any condition to chase after him if he didn't want to be caught. Thankfully, he did turn and tossed his bag back at her feet, albeit reluctantly. I'll see you two tomorrow, she said. Another order. Hana looked like she wanted to say something, but bit her lip and held it back. Sheen collected her things and silently held them out to her. The 2 genin began the walk back to the village in glum silence. Mikoto cursed inwardly. What a mess. This had been simmering since the disastrous mission to the Kusa border, if not even longer. If she'd had any idea Ko's resolve had deteriorated this much, she never would have pressed them the way she had. Ninja made a career out of being hard to read. But the Hyuga boy had taken this to new heights. Ishimaru probably wasn't even fully aware how close to the breaking point his prize student had been. His real teacher should have been the one to set Ko back on course. But Ishimaru wasn't here. That was part of the problem. Thanks to her own efforts, Ko feared and disliked, if not outright hated, his new substitute teacher, and any support she offered would be looked at with suspicion. What a mess. Hakan is right. You can't quit, Mikoto said. Why do you even care? He asked, scowling at a cloud of dirt next to her boot. You think we're nothing but pests. Because you are my student's student and despite my first impression I don't. The exercise was a psychological test as much as a physical one. I wanted to see if your team would splinter under pressure, the same kind of pressure you'll be facing in the exams. I don't torment my students for my own amusement. Under most circumstances, she much preferred being the understanding big sisterly John and instructor archetype than the callous underscore, but Ko didn't know that, and he looked skeptical. A test. All of you passed, Ko snorted. I passed, he said. I find that hard to believe. Why? She asked. You kept your team working together under stress and formulated a successful plan to eliminate a much stronger and more experienced opponent. What makes you so convinced you're not fit to be a Tunin? You were the one sparring with me. That didn't make it obvious. No, it didn't. She crossed her arms over her chest. Explain it to me. Ko drew his knees up under his chin. I'm a complete failure. Everyone in the clan thinks so. Not at being a doctor, maybe, but at being a ninja, he snorted again. The only reason I even graduated on time was because of these. He split his fingers into AV and pointed to his pale, unearly eyes. I can see Tenkaitu as well as anyone else, but I'm so slow and clumsy, it doesn't matter. My taijutsu is so far behind the other kids in the clan. I just can't. I mean, my cousin Nejiun can knock me on the floor and he's 8. I'd be dead weight on a real mission. I'd hold my team back, maybe even get them. What happened to Ishimaru is not your fault, she said firmly, cutting him off. You weren't there. It was. I fell for the trap and I was the one Ishimaru-sensei jumped in to protect. Shin and Hana would have gotten out on their own and out of range. I can't be responsible for something like that ever again. If I stay in Konoha, I can work at the hospital and still help the people that need it. I wouldn't be putting anyone else at risk. His hands tightened around the fabric of his pants, and he looked down at the ground, trying to blink away tears. She pretended not to notice. Team 2 was closer than most, and it was painfully obvious how much the boy cared about his teacher and his teammates. But that attachment had twisted in on itself, leaving him poisoned with guilt if they came to any kind of harm. Every shinobi had to come to terms with that guilt. Quit the life they'd chosen or go mad. She felt for him. Her own crossroads had been Hideki Tsukumo. For months after her teacher's suicide, she racked her brain for some word or gesture that could have lifted his suffocating depression. Some tiny thing she had failed to do that would have made the difference. Time was a save for that failure, and now she knew had done everything she could. It just hadn't been enough. The only option was to keep living her life and cherish the gifts he'd left behind. Tsukumo had been a deeply compassionate man and the finest of teachers. She could only hope she was following in his footsteps. You're afraid? She asked, letting some gentleness into her tone so he didn't think it was an accusation. Yes, he admitted, almost petulant. I'm afraid. I told you I wasn't much of a ninja. Whoever told you ninja are never afraid? She said your fear is a tool. It keeps you from being overly reckless, but you cannot let it control you. Even great ninjas still feel fear. Even the Hokage, the difference between them and you isn't that faster or stronger. It's that at this moment, you've decided to surrender to your fear because it's the easy way out. And that is what myself and your teammates and Ishimaru, if he were here, would find unacceptable. When he said nothing, she continued, you're a Hyuga. You were born with a gift, and it's your duty to put that gift to the best use you possibly can. You're a brilliant field medic. You'd be wasted in the hospital, and you know it. And yes, as a field medic, you will sometimes be required to defend yourself. But that's just it. He said, how can I? I've tried, and my Juken never gets any better. So what if your Juken is terrible? She said, and he flinched from the raw truth. Have you ever tried long-range weapons? Elemental Enjutsu looked into a summoning contract. From the blank look he gave her, she assumed that was a no. The Hyuga were fiercely proud of their eyes, possibly even more so than her own clan, and that pride had, ironically, blinded them to the needs of the young man sitting in front of her. I might have been able to beat you hand to hand, she continued. But when I was younger for a new Chia, my taijutsu was awful. I was too weak, too small, and had no endurance. So I concentrated on what I could do, genjutsu, and made myself one of the best. The way I fought was unorthodox, but it worked, and I succeeded in my missions. The Hyuga elders might not like it at first, but if you have to abandon Juken and find some other way to complete your missions, so be it. It might be hard, but they should come around eventually if you can prove you're a skilled shinobi. But what if they don't? He asked quietly. She took a deep breath. Then that's their failing, not yours. If your family doesn't understand, I'm not saying it won't hurt, but you'll still have the respect of your team and the rest of the medical corps, not to mention all of the Konoha Shishinobi whose lives you'll be able to save. They're more important than the elders' pride. Much more. Ko uncurled himself and looked up at the sun hanging just above the treetops. I really do have to go, he said, no longer petulant, but contemplative. I want to try to catch up with Hana and Shimazen on the way home. She nodded. Tomorrow at 8, she asked. He hesitated for a moment as he picked up his bag. Yes, he said. I'll be there. Over the next few weeks, in between her obligations to her household and Ishimaru's genin, Mikoto would retrain herself. Every day, she pushed a little harder on her early morning runs, another representative with the weights, a little further down on the stretches. She probably wouldn't ever regain the speed and flexibility she'd had at 18, but damned if she wasn't going to try. Her chakra control had slipped along with her physical conditioning, but all that was needed was practice to hone it back to its fine edge. She discreetly participated in the same exercises she assigned her students, watching her own abilities flower again in step with theirs. Ishimaru had done a decent job refining his team's skills in medicine and teamwork, but offensive enjutsu was probably his weakest area. And with his sole elemental affinity being the uncommon wind type, he couldn't teach them what he did know. Their training scenarios became more elaborate as Mikoto rediscovered her love of teaching that had been dormant for so long. She brought out and polished up a selection of jutsu from her arsenal for Hana and Co. Shimin politely declined, preferring to stick to his kikao. Although she was still a bit worried about Ko's emotional fragility, he seemed to have renewed his commitment to advancing. With Mikoto's help, he discovered an unknown affinity for Suiden Enjutsu that dovetailed nicely with his extensive anatomical knowledge and frighteningly adroit chakra control. Since people were about 3 orders made of the stuff, he discovered he could injure them severely by using the water in their own bodies as a weapon and from a much greater distance than was required for Juken. After one particularly gruesome session with a case of melons, Mikoto started to feel preemptively sorry for any Iowa genin unlucky enough to make him angry. She'd let them off easy today and hadn't dispatched a shadow clone to observe their night practice. It was a tacit nudge. Go and relax for a bit. Well, them and herself. She was curled up on the sofa with a bowl of popcorn in her lap. Sasaki snuggled against her left side and she winced when he reached over to grab a handful and pressed against the impressive bruise on her ribs. That was one of Hana's lucky girl. Mikoto surreptitiously readjusted Sasaki, who didn't notice his mother's discomfort. He was utterly absorbed in the highly dramatized account of the founding of Konoha flickering across the black and white screen. Mikoto was keeping a running tally of how often the actors playing Uchiha got their hand signs out of order, but she had to admit there was a genuine emotional force to the cast's performances. Lapses in research aside, Sasaki had started the film on the opposite end of the cushions, but Mikoto had strategically decided to hold the popcorn hostage. As it wore on, he'd inched closer and closer, tired of reaching for the snacks until she had him right where she wanted. It was a little depressing. She had to resort to trickery to get him to cuddle with her like they used to when he was smaller. All 3 of them used to do this, what seemed like ages ago. A half-hour of television serials was one of the few leisure activities her husband had permitted a younger Itachi. After he completed his homework and whatever additional training his father had assigned, he would sink down on the couch to join her. Exhausted from the long day, Sasaki would usually crawl over from his pile of toys, lever himself up by grasping the cushions, and whimper until she lifted him onto the couch. He was a very good-natured baby, inquisitive, and rarely fussy. His antics were usually enough to set a gentle smile on his elder brother's face. Although Itachi would rarely go so far as to play with him, only watch the games his mother initiated. Itachi lost interest in the shows when he graduated the academy. There didn't seem to be enough time for such indulgences after that. Mikoto smothered a yawn with her free hand. This film played on frequent rotation, and she knew it was long. As he promised, Fugaku continued to work long hours at headquarters, rarely arriving home by the dinner hour. Today was no different. Despite the progress he claimed to be making in the case, he was unusually subdued and reluctant to relate any of his successes to her. Itachi too was away from home almost as often. Sometimes on missions, but other days absent for reasons he refused to discuss. As the film wound up to its climactic battle, Sasaki turned at the sound of the front door opening and closing, pushing himself to his feet and bracing his palms against the back of the sofa. Itachi's light footsteps creaked down the floorboards. Do you want to watch the rest of this with me? He called down the hall. It's almost at the best part. Not tonight, Sasaki. He said, pausing at the doorway for a moment. His face was drawn and tired, closer to 30 than 13. There's like 15 minutes left. Please. Perhaps it was a trick of the flickering light, but Itachi seemed to pale as his eyes tracked over the figures on the screen. It had reached the final battle between Moa and the Shoai, and the film studio had spared no expense in recreating it. A sea of twisting branches rendered in choppy stop-motion animation sprouted across the river valley interspersed with bursts of impressive pyrotechnics. Itachi shook his attention free and dropped his eyes from uneven glow. I'm sorry, but I have work to do, he said quietly and turned away to get himself something from the kitchen. Ake sighed disappointed and flopped back down. Turn that garbage off and go to bed, Fugaku called angrily from the front of the house. He stopped in the doorway Itachi had just vacated, glaring at the offending film. Sasaki grunted, confused. It was the end of the week and not nearly time for bed. His father should have been aware of that. I'll assume you didn't hear me, he added caustically. I told you to turn that garbage off. Mikoto could feel a sheen of sweat welling up on her skin from the heat of the anger her husband had brought in with him. Anger and fear. Something had happened or was about to happen and she doubted it had anything to do with her or Sasaki. But it's only Sasaki began. Did you go deaf since breakfast? You know the consequences of not doing what I ask when I ask. I expect proper discipline in this house. His tone had gone from annoyed to dangerous. Sasaki swallowed hard. The punishment for insubordination meant cutting a cane from the stand of bamboo in the garden and then bending over the lip of the wooden porch and circling the house for as many lashes as his father felt was appropriate. It was a cruel, humiliating, and pointless exercise Mikoto could never in the past summon up the will to prevent. Sorry, sir, Sasaki said in a small voice and meekly twisted the knob on the front of the television until it went black with a small pop. Without looking at his father, he backed out of the room and disappeared upstairs. Mikoto put the popcorn aside on the end table and rose to speak to him. It's 8 o'clock on a Friday, she said quietly, too low for Sasaki and Itachi to hear. There's no need to be so. She trailed off as Fugaku narrowed his eyes in disbelief. She'd intended it to come out a sweet and soothing plea for mercy, but her tone was too harsh, venomous. The boy had done nothing wrong. Threatening to beat him for the crime of being nearly confused was a ghastly abuse of paternal authority, one that Mikoto wasn't going to swallow whole. He grabbed her by the upper arm, not quite hard enough to bruise, but very close. I expect proper discipline in this house, he repeated. From my wife, no less than from my children. Mikoto drew in a sharp breath. Was that a threat? Her subconscious reacted as though it was. She could feel a warm prickling in her eyes, the sensation that preceded her sharing flaring to counter one. She could smell the sake on his breath. Too, and more of that rowing anxiety. With effort, she unnoted the muscles of her arm. I'm sorry, she murmured. Although she wasn't, I didn't mean anything by it. There was no reasoning with him when he'd been drinking. He'd never struck her before, but the few times he'd come close, he'd been in this sort of mood. She could ask Itachi what was going on tomorrow, perhaps. Satisfied, he released her. Go make sure Sasaki is settled, he ordered. Itachi and I have things to discuss. She nodded mutely and collected the bowl to deposit in the kitchen. Fugaku and Itachi had already locked themselves in the study when she ascended the stairs, and their forceful whispers faded to nothing as she passed. She didn't bother to wish them a good night. Sasaki had brushed his teeth and threw on his night-sea clothes in double time and was huddled underneath the covers when she came in. I didn't mean it, he said miserably. I really thought he didn't know what time it was. I know, she said soothingly, pulling the blanket straight. Your father just had a long day. Sometimes he gets so tired running the police department, he takes it out on the people he loves. Can you forgive him? He sighed. Still planning to head the department when you grow up? She asked. Of course I am, he said. When I graduate from the academy, I can help him, and then he won't get so worn out. It seems like too much to do being clan head and chief of police at the same time, he added contemplatively. If me and Itachi split the work, then it wouldn't be so bad. Mikoto smiled. I think that's a wonderful idea. Why don't you tell him later to see what he thinks? She settled in to read to him for a while until keeping his eyes open seemed to become more work than it was worth. She shut the door behind her and paused with her hand on the frame. The light was still on in the study. With nothing else to do, she curled up in bed to read and listen to the minutes, then hours tick away alone. Despite the late night, Itachi was gone by the time the sun rose. When pressed, her husband muttered something about clan business in water country and refused to tell her how long Itachi would be gone. Sasaki was understandably upset he hadn't been allowed the chance to say goodbye before his brother left. It was one of their small rituals, but one that the little boy held dear. He still considered Itachi the best shinobi in the world, but was beginning to grasp how much danger he put himself in day after day, and always made sure to extract a promise to train him after the mission was done. These promises stayed only half kept, but Sasaki seemed to take some comfort in them anyway. Itachi would invariably beg off after his return, promising to take the time from a tomorrow that never came. But he did return, and that was the most important part. The mission filled Mikoto with an unease that she couldn't pin down. The Uchiha had supply caches and old hideouts scattered all over the continent from the time predating their settlement in Konoha, which did required periodic upkeep. But such chores were never as urgent as Itachi's assignment seemed to be. She was the one that kept those records, a form of extended housekeeping traditionally given over to the clan head's wife. As she thought, the 2 bases on the islands had been checked and restocked as recently as 6 months ago. She tried to go about her morning chores with her mind carefully blank, but her curiosity was powerful when roused, and she was having difficulty ignoring it. By noon, she had geared up to meet her temporary team and gotten as far as the front door when she stopped, cursed under her breath, and marched back upstairs to Itachi's room. He kept nothing that would finger him as Anbu under his father's roof. But what he hadn't taken would be just as telling. There were signs of hurried packing. His bed was unmade, and the door of his closet ajar. His weapons chest was locked, of course. With a small boy in the house, anything less than flawless weapons etiquette could easily end in tragedy. Mikoto knelt in front of it, biting her lip, then extracted a set of lock picks from a hidden flap in her heavy gloves. It didn't take her long to pop the lock. It was intended to discourage small and curious fingers, not fellow shinobi. The contents were unremarkable. Standard shinobi tools, kunai and shuriken, sunbon in small wooden boxes, various tags in neatly labeled piles, razor wire, vials of poison, and his short-range radio. Mikoto frowned. That meant this was a solo assignment. Even Ambu almost always worked in pairs. She had a bad feeling his porcelain mask was still hanging in his locker at headquarters. She flipped the on switch on the inside of the chest door that would ensure it locked itself and backed out of the closet. Mikoto made her way to the training ground and began drilling her students with only half her mind on the work. Her snooping had raised more questions than it answered. That Itachi went as a representative of the Uchiha, not Konoha, troubled her almost more than his hellish destination. He was Anbu. And besides, the Uchiha had no clan business in Kiri. The leader of the Bloody Mist village was psychopathic even by the standards of shinobi, a young man barely 18 years old who set school children against each other in fights to the death. He'd assumed the Mizukage's mantle at 15, expanding exponentially upon an already well-entrenched tradition of betrayal and brutality in that village. His predecessor died a natural death by drowning, as did the entire ruling council. 4 floors up from sea level on a cloudless day. The people of the countryside loathed the hidden village and everyone in it, and for good reason. The civilian government had been butchered in the military coup that coincided with the Sandaime Mizukage's rise to power, and the Yandaime crushed the lingering resistance with an even more sadistic relish. The Kiri ninja took whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, be it food, money, medicine, or women, keeping the common people terrorized and destitute. They in turn had begun lashing out at any hidden villager they could. The most obvious being those with Kekjenk. Since trained ninja were too difficult to attack directly, most of the abuse was heaped on the undeserving, the children of rape with the poor luck to bear outward signs of their parentage. It was not a place anyone from Konoha would go willingly. Days passed and Fugaku continued to resist all her efforts to extract more information. It bothered her, but her days were full of lessons plans and her night's meals with neighbors and friends. And there was one more thing that succeeded in fully distracting her from the prickle of suspicion at the back of her mind. She found herself in possession of a third son. Nar had begun to wander home with her and Sasaki after school whenever she would let him, which became more and more often as the days went by. Besides making sure he was properly fed and sporadically washed, she began instructing him on the various niceties of civilization for which he had no other teachers. If people complained the boy was a beast, it was no wonder. He had no table manners, no concept of when it was okay to scream and when it wasn't, and no patience for sitting still unless she let him run. Sasaki ragged on games of tag. Neither had he ever been taught his hand signs, how to meditate, how to handle bladed weapons, or even his basic kanji, among the dozens of other things the children of shinobi came to class knowing. Left on his own, she discovered he stayed up watching television all night and slept through class during the day, and none of the teachers would bother to wake him unless he was snoring like a chainsaw. Consequently, no homework assignments were ever completed, and almost all tests were failed. All of these factors combined to give him the reputation of a less than lovable idiot and probable rank of dead last when progress reports were to come out mid-semester. And it wasn't fair because Naruto wasn't an idiot. He behaved very much like what she remembered of Kusha during their school years, although to more of an extreme. He had so much physical energy, it was difficult for him to sit and concentrate on books or worksheets. But he possessed a sort of intuitive idiosyncratic brilliance that wasn't well measured by the tests he was given in the classroom. He learned with his body, not his eyes, and when he applied himself, he could absorb new techniques like a sponge. In this area, it was Sasaki that was teaching him the most. He used Nar as his personal punching bag in his quest to catch up to Itachi. And Nar in turn was doing his damnedest to catch up to Sasaki and in amazingly creative ways. With any other child, she would have been worried for his safety. But Naruto was so determined, not to mention durable, that she only got out the first aid kit yet again, and didn't bother warning them to be careful. When he was grown and out in the field, his remarkable resilience and ability to improvise quickly and well would make him a valuable squad leader. It was too bad she seemed to be the only person in the village to have noticed this. Almost all the other parents looked at her as if they were questioning her sanity when they went to fetch their own children, and she returned their stares with defiance. There weren't many people who could match the intensity of Anchia's gaze, and she noticed that the discrimination against Naruto became slightly less blatant now that she had tucked him under her wing. She never openly threatened anyone. That was much too crass. But her status and connections to the police made harassing the blonde boy seem suddenly less tempting. She was almost naive enough to think that some of the parents might be warming up to him. That perhaps the village was beginning to accept him as a boy, not as the prison for a demon. A month into the semester, Sasaki came home from school and promptly handed her a square of folded yellow paper, and those dreams were dashed. Mizuki-sensei said, I had to be sure to give this to you. It's important, he said, holding it out to her. Mikoto accepted the paper from him and scanned it while he began tucking into the after-school snack she'd placed on the table. A parents' meeting. That was odd. She thought they'd gotten most of those orientation meetings for parents of new students out of the way in the first week. But as she read further, she saw it wasn't only for parents of first-year students. It was for everyone. Her hand tightened on the leaf of thin paper until her knuckles went white. A coalition of concerned parents. Possible danger to the students to discuss whether undesirable elements should be removed from the classroom. This had to be about Someone or someone had gotten it into their heads to remove him from the academy. They were doing it through official legal channels, too. So, the persecution was no longer a police matter. Was this why the other parents' bullying had tapered off? Because they were planning something even bigger. Mikoto folded the notice up and put it in her apron pocket. Whoever had orchestrated this needed to be taught they had crossed the wrong woman. Unfortunately, she didn't have many connections in the school and she was operating blind. Until now, she hadn't needed any. Itachi had attended for barely a year before being promoted to genin and she hadn't had the opportunity to get to know many of the teachers. She didn't know if anyone in the administration had it out for Naruto because he was a gentry or simply because he was a troublemaker. Over the next few days, she dropped a few hints into her pool of friends and got no bites. That meant it was probably a civilian. The two groups tended to form discreet social circles. Her attempts even went so far as to interrogate the school secretary under a genjutsu to attempt to wrestle out the names of the instigators, but the grandmotherly woman had only photocopied the notices and was ignorant of any plots. Out of options, she applied for an audience with the Hokage, but found his schedule booked past the date of the meeting. The parents had been given very little notice, which must have been intentional. It lessened the chances anyone against Naruto's expulsion would be able to muster support or even attend. She was becoming anxious for him. If this plan succeeded, it would affect more than the parents' precious illusions of safety. They certainly wouldn't want the boy running loose all day, wreaking havoc. So, what did they want to do with him? Lock him up all alone until he became as misanthropic and crazy as I was. Vessel, to be rolled out of storage like a ballista every time a war needed fighting. She had never seen the Gobi herself, but some of her friends from her academy days had faced him, and the consensus was that he was almost as dangerous to the men on his own side as he was to his ostensible enemies. Even when he wasn't transformed, that would not happen to Nar. The prospect frightened her, and not only out of concern for his well-being, he was kind, loyal, clever in the most unusual ways, and extraordinarily strong. Each additional tale made Aiju more fearsome than the one before, with the QB the most powerful of them all. Out of curiosity, pretending it was a game, she'd tested his chakra reserves. They eclipsed those of many adult jonin at just 6 years old, and chakra capacity only grew with age. As a grown man, properly trained, he could very well become the most powerful shinobi alive. The thought of that strength corrupted by cruelty and abuse chilled her to her bones. A Naruto that had nothing to cherish or protect, and the power of 9 tails at his beck and call. No mortal could hope to contain the magnitude of that destruction. He could probably turn the whole of Fire Country to slag if he so chose. Beyond frustrated, she asked herself how anyone could be so blind. But she already knew that could have been her a month ago if she still thought the QB had any influence over him. That thirst for vengeance was blinding. It twisted up perfectly good people into the very monsters they were so desperate to destroy. And she had almost become one of them. When she took the time to think about it, it shocked her to see how quickly she had gone from despising Naruto to protecting him as if he were her own son. He was no angel, but something in those big blue eyes made you want to do right by him, if you'd only take the time to look. Although she wished dearly it had been otherwise, perhaps Naruto was fated to be the vessel for a demon he loved so deeply and so strongly none of its malice was allowed to pierce through. The night of the meeting, she collected the 2 other families among the Uchiha that had school-aged children and were available to attend. They were her only 4 nominal allies. Both of the fathers were rank-and-file members of the military police and the mothers from small and unremarkable shinobi families. Both women, since they had married into the clan, had next to no status and treated her with deference. Their children were older but played with Sasaki fairly often. And since Naruto was now often found wherever Sasaki was, the rambunctious blonde was sometimes included in their games. On the short walk to the school, they agreed with practically everything she said. One even going so far as to comment that the Uzumaki boy was rather sweet when you got to know him. It was bolstering to the ego, but she had a lot of people to convince and not very much time. And as far as she knew, she had no one with power on her side. The meeting was held in the gymnasium to accommodate the crowd, and the assistant teachers were still scurrying about setting up folding chairs when she arrived. She smiled at Iruka when he trotted by with an armful, but wasted no time in working the room. She greeted a few old school friends, probing the general mood. One or two of the civilian mothers looked at her smugly, and she immediately marked them and everyone in their little conversational circles as hostile. A few of the clan heads or their wives were in attendance, none of whom she could count firmly as allies. She nodded coolly to Hyuga Hiyashi as she passed him, who looked stern, regal, and incredibly offended by the seating arrangements. He didn't seem to like Nar, although she'd caught his daughter shyly trailing the boy with an adorable flush on her cheeks, but he didn't go out of his way to be punitive either. Inzuka soon throaty laughter identified her immediately, and when Mikoto greeted her, she had to slither out of the way of a hearty backslapping and inquiries about what sort of horrible things she was doing to her daughter. People paused in their quiet conversation to stare. It took a moment before Mikoto realized she was talking about Hana's training, which left her less confused, but not less peeved. Some had always annoyed her. She was uninhibited, uncool and unquestionably in charge, the only female clan head in Konoha. Maybe she was just a touch jealous, a touch. The principal strode in exactly on the hour, and the assistant teachers politely shooed everyone into their seats. She extended her senses around her, searching for more hostile feelings as the principal got his papers in order. Luckily, the most blatant of these were all civilians, and they had less say in village affairs. If one of the large clans had lent their support, Naruto might have been in real trouble. The principal cleared his throat, and the whispering hushed. He was a roundish man in early middle age, and still wore his hit. She couldn't help but notice that the hands that gripped the podium had only 7 full fingers, preventing him from ever forming hand signs. He must have chosen to become an administrator instead of retiring. I've called this meeting at the request of several concerned parents, he said, sounding slightly bored. We are here to discuss the potential danger a particular student, and I believe all of you know who I mean, may pose to his peers. At the end of this meeting, both parents and teachers will vote whether they wish to keep him in the school or remove him from the classroom and arrange for a private tutor. As moderator, I will not vote. Please wait for your chance to speak. I will call you to stand in the order I see you. A tall woman with a very long braid promptly shot her hand up in the air and was on her feet as soon as the principal acknowledged her. This boy is dangerous. I know it and you know it. And I will not stand for letting him run around loose where the other students are playing. If it was up to me, he'd be locked up for his own good and the good of Konoha. It's only a matter of time before something happens to set him off. And then what? If he hurts even one of our children, if he hurts my daughter, she paused, squaring her shoulders. I may not be a ninja, but I can tell you the Hokage will have hell to pay. Dangerous weapons that can go off at any moment need to be shut up away from innocent people. It's as simple as that. Several heads around the room began to nod. Mikoto took a deep breath and raised her hand. The principal's eyes alighted on her and she stood. She turned her head to address the civilian woman who had spoken. Don't you trust the Yandaime? She asked sweetly, her voice carrying an undercurrent of accusation to every corner of the room. The danger is contained. He sacrificed his own life to be sure of that. She swept her eyes over the assembled people, noting who flinched away from her piercing gaze. It was almost all civilians. At least some of the ninja understood. He had to make a terrible choice for one of our children. Life would be difficult for this helpless newborn baby. Not only had he been orphaned, but he'd be given a responsibility so great I can barely imagine it. The Yandaime gave his life for this village, and in return, he rightly expected the village to do for him what he could not. I'm sure it was his dying wish that we take this boy into our hearts, all of us, and step in place of the father and mother that fate had denied this child. That we are here having this meeting is proof his faith in us seems to have been misplaced. As he is now, this boy is not a danger. Some of you may have heard stories from other hidden villages how murderous these vessels can be. So, I'll ask you this. If you were tossed out on your own, no family, no friends, and cursed, cheated, spat on, and beaten up for reasons your child's mind couldn't even begin to grasp, how would you react? What kind of person would you grow up to be? Mikoto paused to let her audience's mind fill in the gaps. Some of the parents were outright squirming in their chairs. Good. I understand that you're frightened for your children's safety, but if you really want to protect them, give this boy a reason to protect them, and he will do it. Give him a home, an anchor. That's all he's ever asked you for. She smoothed out her kimono and sat down, hands folded on her lap. From farther down her row, Nar Shikaku caught her eye and nodded once almost imperceptibly. He must have been the father of that Nar boy in Sasuke's class. She didn't know him well, but he had been a close friend of Minato's, and his wife was one of the few mothers who had shown absolutely no animosity towards Nar. Not to be outdone or shamed by an equally prestigious clan, Hyuga Hiyashi stood next. What was done, and there is no vengeance to be found here any longer. We could just as soon seek it against an earthquake or a typhoon to as much purpose. But the boy is wild. He needs discipline if he is to serve Konoha properly as a shinobi. There is no better place for him to learn this than the academy. Mikoto's brows creased in pleasant surprise. She didn't like the head of the Hyuga clan, but she wasn't going to turn away his support just because he was a pompous. She inclined her head in silent thanks. A civilian father took the floor next and repeated with more venom what the first woman had said. After him was a kunoichi with a toddler on her hip and the lines beneath her eyes that were the mark of a Serbi summoning master. Unsurprisingly, she argued in favor of keeping Naruto in the school. The debate went round and round for almost 2 hours until the principal finally called a halt and took the vote by raised hands to allow Naruto's continued attendance. Mikoto had to force herself to breath while one by one more hands joined her own. The margin was narrow, but her side was victorious. There was just one more thing left to worry about as she strolled home with the other Uchiha parents. She could only hope word of this meeting and her role in it would never reach Nar. If he learned she'd voted against letting him cut class for the rest of his life, he might never forgive her. The anti-Nar faction did not accept their defeat gracefully and passed their shame on to their children, the one outlet they had left. The bullying spiked and Naruto was coming home with more and more bruises. The most the teachers contributed to the situation were a few half-hearted reprimands that stopped nothing. Mikoto couldn't pin a thing on the parents, and the police didn't become involved in schoolyard fights unless they necessitated a stay in the intensive care ward for one or more of the participants. Nar didn't seem to be taking the bloodied noses too badly, at least. If anything, the harassment was having the opposite of its intended effect. The more intense his opposition became, the more determined Naruto was to overcome it, seemingly out of pure contrariness. He'd never had any compunctions about not showing up to class before. But now, he was appearing on the playground long before the bell rang, practically daring the other children to chase him away. The problem was that it was escalating with no end in sight, and she did not want to find out how far the QB's ability to heal him went. A bone broken and not correctly set could end his career as a shinobi before it had a proper beginning. This continued for about a week and a half until Sasaki neatly solved the problem for her. There were certain things the citizens of Konoha had learned not to do, like how it was better not to swat small grayish beetles within 100 paces of the Ibarame neighborhood, or how women didn't go into public baths without stuffing a washcloth or two in the cracks and KN holes of the dividing screen, and how nobody went out of their way to cross an Uchiha. It just wasn't done. It was true. Sasaki was a small, adorable 7-year-old Uchiha, but the basic principle still stood. He believed himself to be the only one allowed to beat up Naruto with impunity and was extremely protective of this privilege. She learned exactly how protective when a neighbor's daughter, breathless from running all the way home from school, knocked on the door and told her the principal needed to see her. Immediately, she changed out of her house dress and strode to his office as quickly as her kimono would allow. Sasaki didn't get into fights at school, at least not the sort that would require her presence. The only person he seemed to enjoy punching was Nar, and their understanding was such that the both of them were quite content to sit on the porch and share popsicles after beating each other black and blue. She was certain it wasn't one of their scuffles that was behind this call. The day a fellow student was disciplined for bullying the gentry was the day the QB went paws up for belly scratches from the Hokage. It seemed equally unlikely Sasaki would pick a fight with anyone else. He didn't have the temperament of a bully, and those in the school that did knew going after the son of the chief of police and head of the Uchiha clan was veritable suicide. Upon arriving, she asked directions to the principal's office from one of the students sweeping the hall. He directed her to the second floor with a deferential nod. "You can go in, Uchiha-sama," his secretary, murmured when she appeared before the woman's desk. Sasaki, is already with him. She pushed down the door handle and let herself inside. Sasaki was sitting on one of the plastic chairs next to the door, kicking his heels against the footrest and looking utterly unrepentant about whatever infraction he'd committed. That was strange. Sasaki would do anything to keep his father happy, and nothing made his father so happy as perfect discipline. Nar occupied the chair on the opposite side. He was holding a bloody tissue to his nose, hunched over and breathing shallowly as if the motion pained him. Sasaki hadn't a scratch on him. The sole evidence of his supposed fight was a little dirt ground into his knees. Thank you for coming so quickly, Uchiha-sama, the principal said, rising to greet her from behind his battered steel desk. I'm sure you're curious as to why. Sasaki has never given me a reason before, she said pointedly, looking over her shoulder at him. No, he hasn't, he said, settling himself behind the desk again. Until today, his behavior and his marks have been exemplary. Frankly, I was as surprised he got involved in a fight as you are. He paused to remove his glasses, looking piercingly at Sashake. As you know, this is a military school, and supervised spars between students in the same grade are a daily part of their activities. What we do not condone here is all-out brawling, especially not when several stronger students gang up on someone much weaker. Suspension is the usual punishment when this occurs. Oh, bullsh. Naruto piped up angrily. The principal slammed his hand down on a pile of papers, cutting him off and making Mikoto start. You'll speak when asked a question and not before. And if you use that language with me again, I'll have you mopping the classroom floors with your tongue. As I was saying, he continued, that is the usual punishment. Your son's case is rather odd. Sasaki, please explain to your mother what happened this afternoon. The truth, if you please. Sasaki considered this for a moment and then locked eyes with the principal without flinching. No, excuse me, he said, dumbfounded. I can't. I tried already. You didn't want to listen to what really happened, only what you think happened. So, I figured that means you want me to lie. And one thing I was taught to never do was lie to my mother. Sasaki crossed his arms over his chest in a blatant challenge. Sasaki, she said sharply for Apparank's sake. The man turned very red, outmaneuvered by a 7-year-old. That must be embarrassing. A few words, if they were chosen carefully, were enough to upset the assumptions about who was powerful and who was powerless. It was a lesson in which she'd excelled. That's my son, she thought, suppressing a smirk. Detention tomorrow for both of you on top of whatever else I decide to hand out. Wait in the hall, he ordered, fuming. Both of them slipped down from their chairs and filed out. Naruto trying not to let on that he was limping. I'm terribly sorry, Principal Sato, she said, her eyes on her clenched hands. This is probably my fault. His father has been working such long hours lately. I'm afraid I've spoiled him. I'll try to be firmer. Her mousy manner punctured his temper, and his posture immediately relaxed. No, don't take it on yourself, he said soothingly. It's a hard life we led. I'm sure you've done your best with what you've been dealt. In any case, he was defending a comrade. I suppose I can't fault him for the sentiment. What did happen this afternoon? She asked. Utsuaki Naruto decided it would be a good idea to prank 3 fourth-year students by stealing their belts while they were in the gymnasium pool. Understandably, when they discovered the theft, they attempted to retrieve the stolen property. When Nar wouldn't relinquish them, they attempted to recover the items with force. It was at this point Sasaki-kun intervened. He conspired with Naruto to lure the 3 boys into a deserted corner of the grounds, at which point he apparently incapacitated all of them. One had to be taken to the hospital to be checked out for a concussion. I see, she replied, her delicate eyebrows arching high. Is he all right? Yes, it was mild, he answered. The medics are keeping him overnight only as a precaution. You had Nar checked out, too. I hope, she asked with the same expression of offhand concern. It's been quite a while since first response medical training for me, but it looked as if he was breathing like someone with a cracked rib. Of course, I offered to have him taken to the hospital. What kind of heartless tyrant do you think I am? He absolutely refused, and my staff have better things to do than chase him down and drag him there bodily. Besides, he said uncomfortably. He looked all right to me. Mikoto kept the bland look fixed on her face. Of all the stupid lazy, of course, he didn't want to go to the hospital. What 6-year-old would? He may be living on his own, but he certainly didn't have the maturity or knowledge to be making his own medical decisions. She was really starting to question the Hogue's wisdom in letting the boy loose on his own. Shinobi children grew up fast, but this was pushing it even in a hidden village. I gave out a days in school suspension for the older boys for attempting to take matters into their own hands in regards to the theft, the principal said, hastily changing the subject. Getting beaten up by a first-year student was almost punishment enough. 3 for Sasaki and Nar for stealing in the first place and attacking fellow students outside of a sanctioned spar. Whatever you think is fair, Principal Sato, she said deferentially. She wasn't wasting any more time on this fool. Nar needed medical attention before he did something rambunctiously stupid and punctured an internal organ. His father will ensure it doesn't happen again. Ah, well, thank you for your time, Uchi-sama, he said with forced geniality. I'm sure your husband takes the discipline of his children very seriously. He seemed only peripherally aware he'd come out of this discussion, missing a large chunk of his dignity. Idiot. He rose to see her out, fixing an ill-tempered glare on Nar before shutting the door. She pulled both boys into a deserted classroom, and they both began talking at once. Quiet, please, she said sharply over the conflicting babble. I don't know exactly what happened, and at this moment, I don't care. When one of your comrades is injured, excuses can wait. Nar, lie down and show me where your chest hurts. With some grumbling, he lay down on the tiles, his head pillowed on his book bag. Down here, on that side, he said, hiking up his shirt and pointing to the beginning of a sickly red-purple bruise. She knelt and probed the area gently with her fingers, making him hiss in pain. Probably 2 ribs cracked, at least. The injury wasn't serious as long as it wasn't exacerbated. Unfortunately, Nar seemed to take pain as a challenge rather than a warning, and exacerbating was probably the next thing on his agenda. She wasn't sure she had the influence over him to convince him to go to the hospital without a tantrum. And the absolute last thing she needed was for him to go tearing off by himself. That meant the next best thing. She formed the signs for the chosen jutsu, holding her hands over the bruise as they began to glow softly green. The chosen worked by providing the cells in the patient's body with the energy to divide much more quickly than normal. It was not without its risks. It was all too easy to overload and destroy the tissue or force too much of the user's chakra into their patient's pathways and knock them unconscious. Anything more complex than healing clean cuts and uncomplicated fractures was beyond her, but that was enough for a first response medic and enough here. Wow, Mom, I didn't know you could use healing chakra, Sasaki commented, sounding impressed. Yuji Ohasans told me stories about when you used to be a shinobi, but questions later, she said firmly. I'm not a medical specialist, and I really need to concentrate. Sasaki sat back on his heels to watch her work, intermittently glaring at Naruto whenever he was about to open his mouth. Knitting the bones didn't take long. His body seemed inordinately responsive to the influx of healing chakra. Just like Kasha's had been now that she remembered, it was a good thing Naruto had been her first medical patch job in the better part of 6 years. The training with Team 2 had resharpened her control, but what a good chosen jutsu required was on a whole other level. She was positive she overloaded it, although her patient seemed totally oblivious to its soporific side effects. His chakra system must be used to an incredibly heavy load. Better. She asked when Nar had sat up and gingerly prodded his ribs. It would take a few days to heal completely, but the process was far enough along that he wouldn't be able to complicate the injury. Way better, he said after a few deep breaths. Principal Sato is a jerk. He should have given Sasaki a medal, not a suspension. Please don't ground him. All right. Now, I want to hear your side of the story, Sasaki, she said, and added in a gentler voice. If you're really truthful with me and attack those boys purely to defend Nar, I will put in the best possible words with your father. He let out a deep breath and began to explain, Nar inserting frequent commentary. The 3 older boys had, unsurprisingly, lied to the teachers about Naruto stealing their possessions. In reality, he'd been eating a snack in the shade of some training equipment on the far side of the lot, away from his classmates. They'd come shouting about, catching the thief as they burst out of the doors of the gymnasium, only to give themselves an excuse. Sasaki knew those 3 were trouble and had followed at a discreet distance. The 2 of them had already worked out a strategy for dealing with the bullies. If Naruto couldn't handle it himself, he'd shout out a code word to Sasaki and try to lure his attackers away from their reinforcements. Sasaki would then be lying in wait at the predetermined spot to distract them, giving Naruto the chance to escape. This time, Naruto hadn't been fast enough, twisting his ankle in an attempt to avoid their blunt practice kai. One of the boys had landed a bone-cracking kick when he was already on the ground and sensed Sasaki had attacked them head-on instead of merely acting as a distraction. The older boys had grossly underestimated how good his taijutsu was for being only 7. And in those moments of confusion, he'd managed to overcome them. Mikoto was impressed not only at his combat skills, which were gaining on his brothers at that age, but that he was willing to take on 3 much stronger opponents for someone that wasn't even of his clan. The Uchiha tended to keep to themselves the altruistic impulses that defined the allies of the Senju, manifesting only rarely. They were simply taught such a thing was a sign of weakness, and almost all of them learned to discount such thoughts as unbecoming of Anchia. Her lovable nitwit nephew Obito, who'd held the unenviable position of designated family screw-up, had failed to learn that lesson like he'd failed to learn a lot of others. Tsukumo had eventually beaten it out of Mikoto, too. Although it had taken most of her first year as a genin, she was glad Sasuke had someone like Naruto as his teacher. She ushered the boys home and set them to work on their assignments as if today was a day like any other. She did have to tell Fugaku eventually, who was predictably angry, but her floor descriptions of Sasake's victory over the older students put her husband in a more charitable mood. He handed out extra training and grounded Sasaki for the next week, but didn't even mention caning him. Fugaku even slotted in some sideways praise of his younger son in between the lectures about not disrespecting one's superiors. It was subtle, but Sasuke could sniff out his father's approval like a bloodhound on the track. No boy who, just been grounded had ever looked so cheerful. The other side couldn't hold a candle to Naruto's stubborn determination. And now that there were rumors a Secunda prodigy was ready to blacken the eyes of anyone who looked at him funny, the bullies scuttled back into the woodwork. Most of his classmates still treated Naruto like a pariah, and the teachers were almost as bad. But there was nothing more she could do about that at present. It was a victory, if a small one, and she had very little time to spare. Her Airsoft's Janine team was counting down the days until they had to embark for Iwagakure, and she was determined to wring as much excellence out of them as she could. Although half of her didn't want the training to end, Mikoto breathed a metaphorical sigh of relief when she bid Team 2 good luck at the gates. One of the other Jonin would be escorting them along with his own team. Ishimaru had recently been released from the hospital and would be retaking leadership as soon as they returned from the exams. Mikoto would then be stepping meekly back into retirement. The young shinobi had as many new tricks up their sleeves as she could cram in within a month, and it was out of her hands now. After they had gone, she found she had missed teaching so much that going back home was like a prison sentence. The amount of work it took was draining, but she was seriously considering applying for a part-time position at the academy, whether or not Fugaku was enthusiastic about it. She imagined the turnover to be fairly high, and with her social connections and mission record, she doubted they'd turn her away. While she had the experience, what she was missing was the piece of paper to make it official. A week after Team 2 returned to Konoha, none passed the mission simulation, but came back whole, and in fairly good spirits. She decided to corner Yumino Iruka and see how much of a pain a teaching certification would be to secure, since he must have just gotten his this year. Now that she was less worried about Naruto being jumped after school, the boys usually made their own way home. This time it made sense to pick them up after that chat with Iruka and afterwards perhaps stopped by that restaurant Sasaki liked so much. The after-school training regimen his father assigned him as punishment had been grueling. Some anugiri were just the thing to soothe the mother's guilty conscience. Ooh. Mikoto knew immediately something was wrong when a small blonde projectile didn't come screaming towards her when she stepped into the schoolyard. Sasaki was playing with two Uchiha boys a couple years ahead of him and he waved at her upside down from his perch on the monkey bars. But where was Nar? A quick scan for his vibrant chakra signature revealed him to be curled up in the shade of the school wall around the corner. His arms were folded over his belly and he looked distressingly pale. He smiled wanly when she knelt down next to him. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked, pressing her hand experimentally to his forehead and cheeks. He was very warm. "My stomach really hurts," he whispered. "Ururuka-sensei took me to the nurse after I threw up on his shoes, but she kicked me out when the last bell rang." "Did you have something funny to eat last night?" she asked. "I don't think there's a stomach bug going around." "Bunch of ramen cups. What I have all the time," he answered and screwed up his face at a particularly sharp cramp in his gut. "But I had the rest of yesterday's bento for breakfast. I found it in my locker." "Ah, at least I think it was yesterday's." Mikoto pinched the bridge of her nose. "Poor stupid kid. That would certainly explain it. I guess no one ever told you this, but you can't eat food with meat in it that's been sitting in a warm place for a long time." He grimaced. "But it tasted okay. That doesn't matter. Germs that can make you really sick grow fast in warm places, and you can't always taste it if that happens." "Oh, I thought food was only bad if it started getting fuzzy, but I can cut it off usually." Mikoto sighed. It might have been a little funny if he hadn't looked so miserable, and real hunger hadn't been the driving force behind his peculiar behavior. Given how little his landlady fed him and how small his allowance probably was, it was a miracle he hadn't been picking through dumpsters to satisfy his enormous appetite. Or maybe he had been. Mikoto honestly didn't want to know how low his definition of edible went. "Uchiha-sama," a man called from behind her. She stood to see Yuminoa jogging towards her, looking anxious. "I'm really sorry to bother you about this, but honestly, I couldn't think of anyone else who'd help. I'd understand if it's not possible, but would you be willing to let Naruto stay with you for a couple of days? You probably noticed, but I think he's coming down with something." He looked genuinely concerned. That was new. Until recently, he'd ignored Naruto as stolidly as the other instructors. "Of course," she said without hesitation. "Thanks so much," he said, surprised she'd agreed with no reservations. From what he's told me about her, I don't trust his landlady to check on him, and he's not nearly sick enough that I'd feel comfortable bothering the hospital staff. Sorry about your sandals, Oruka-sensei, Naruto mumbled. Or gave him a strange smile. Oh, that's okay. I know you couldn't help it. Suzu-sensei said it happens to every teacher. Eventually, he extended a hand to help Naruto up. Think you can make it to the Uchiha district? She's doing you a very big favor, he prompted. Oh, right. Thanks, Mikoto Obakan. You're nice, he said, and then added. Sasuke is really lucky he's got a mom like you. She smiled outwardly at the compliment, but inside felt a pang of grief. I wish you did, too, Nar. Since I'm guessing he'll be out for a few days. I have all of his books and things in the office, Uruka said. I'll show you the assignments if you don't mind following me. She was about to ask Uruka to simply bring them out here, but he looked suspiciously like he wanted to speak with her alone. She was curious about the sudden reversal in his demeanor and obediently followed. The teaching certification could wait. The office was a mess of papers and grade books, clearly belonging to several teachers. He wouldn't have enough seniority to merit his own desk quite yet. Nonchalantly, he closed the door behind him and began riffling through the piles of books. That was considerate of you to see if I could look after him, she said. One of the other teachers would have left him to fend for himself. He winced a little. I've been thinking about what you said at the meeting, about giving him an anchor. It was something I wished I had when I was younger. What do you mean? She asked, curious. My parents, he said, pausing with a handful of papers in his fist. They were killed by the QB. I was 10. My uncle took me in, but he thought I was a weakling that would never make it past Genin. Every day I was living in his house. I wished for someone to believe in me the way my mother and father did. I'm sorry, she said. I lost family, too. My mother and my 2 older brothers. I know how much it hurts. He nodded. I visited the memorial stone almost every day back then. I would read the names over and over and over, and I still remember how many of them started with Uchiha. It really made me think about what I was doing. Naruto was the last orphan the QB made, and I know what happened. It's not his fault. If you could find it in your heart to be kind to him, why couldn't I? More than any of the other teachers, I understand what he's going through. Thank you, she said, deeply grateful. It would mean a lot to him, not to mention me, to know that he'll have at least one ally here. I'm pretty much the bottom rung on the ladder, but I'll do my best. He cleared his throat and held out the books in a folder of papers. I know you'll want to get going, so Oruka-sensei, she said, balancing the books against her hip. Yes, ma'am. You're a very kind person. Don't ever confuse that with weakness. They're very different things. He grinned, looking embarrassed, and pushed open the office door for her. Once outside, she called out to Sasaki to let him know they were leaving and began the 15-minute walk to the Uchiha district. Nar clung to her hand, but didn't utter a word of complaint about his stomach ache. Sasaki latched onto the opportunity to tease the normally energetic loser for being so slow. Even after Mikoto snapped at him to knock it off, he was the more naturally talented of the two of them. But it irked him he could never keep up with his friend's sheer stamina. He even lost a few sparring matches this way. When Nar kept on getting up until Sasaki was too tired and frustrated to hit him anymore. When they were half a block from home, Nar moaned aloud and doubled over in pain. Sasaki suddenly looked sorry he'd teased Nar practically the whole way, although he was still too proud to apologize aloud. Nar was a little big for this, but still Mikoto scooped up the sick boy and carried him all the way to the mansion's guest bedroom, shoes and all. Sasaki opened the doors for her without being asked. Is he going to be okay? Her son asked, apprehensively, peering around her waist as she laid Nar down on the narrow bed. Of course he will. He's going to feel awful for the next few days, but I don't think it's serious, she said. An idea occurred to her. Hey, you know what would be a big help? Before dinner, can you run over to his apartment and get some changes of clothes and his toothbrush and any of his toys you think might make him feel better? Sure, Sasaki said. Naruto dug around under his shirt for the string that held his house key and handed it to Sasaki. Don't steal any of my stuff. Like I would, he replied and stuck out his tongue before trotting off. Hey, Sasaki, he called down the hall. Thanks, Mikoto smiled at this unexpected display of manners. While Naruto undressed and changed into a spare set of Sasake's night clothes, Mikoto set him up with a glass of water, a basin, plenty of blankets, and instructions to give her a shout if he needed anything. On a whim, she added a light kiss on his forehead before turning off the light. She'd need to explain the extra pair of shoes she was about to toss in the foyer to Fugaku, and he wouldn't like that they belonged to Uzumaki Naruto. She planned to tell him the truth, but it didn't have to be the whole truth. She only needed to mention she was caring for an ill child who didn't have anywhere else to go. There were enough of those not to arouse suspicion. It could be difficult to support a family on lower Chunin level pay, and both parents might be out on missions to make ends meet. Also that Fugaku probably shouldn't be poking around in the guest room because there was a small chance the kid was contagious. That was enough in line with his notion of her as wife and mother, and he didn't have much interest in her womanly sphere as long as dinner appeared on the table, and clean uniforms appeared in his closet. Sasaki returned after a short while with an armful of clothes, a toothbrush, and a plush frog, which he deposited on Naruto's bed. She set him to work on some math problems while she tidied up the house. Fugaku was at a meeting of the clan council, which turned out to be rather convenient. Although it was strange they weren't holding it here. Customarily, such meetings would take place in the clan head's house. Although he was absolutely miserable, Naruto hadn't called out to her once so far that night. He must have been accustomed to suffering through illness alone. After dinner, she couldn't just go about her usual round of housework. After Sasaki had finished his assignments and gone to bed, she filled a small bowl with water and grabbed a washcloth from the master bath. Nar was awake when she slid open the door, curled up around the pains in his belly, and shivering with fever. "How are you holding up?" she asked, brushing some clumps of damp hair away from his face. "Hurts everywhere," he answered wretchedly, "but my stomach hurts worst." He curled a little bit and looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. "I think I might be dying." She set the water down on the nightstand, wrung out the washcloth, and began dabbing it against his hot skin. "You are absolutely not dying," she assured him. "You might feel like it, but you're not. The first day is always the worst when you get sick from bad food. You'll feel a little better tomorrow and even better the day after that." "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm a mom. We know about this stuff," she answered playfully. "But I can stay here with you for a while just in case." The worry teasing up his eyebrows melted away at her reassurance. "That makes my head feel better," he whispered. "Can you do it more?" "As long as you want," she said. Mikoto ended up sitting up with him for hours, reading a chapter or two from one of Sasake's adventure novels in between the dashes to the bathroom. It was almost 2 o'clock in the morning when she finally sensed her husband coming down the street and snuck off to change into her nightgown and greet him. She'd be fuzzy-headed tomorrow, but she'd completed a rank missions on less sleep. She'd be able to manage breakfast. Mikoto padded into the kitchen with an empty water glass, her hair carefully mused, as though she'd been in bed for hours. "Late night again?" she asked as Fugaku pulled off his sandals, his back to her. "He rire of cigarettes." She narrowed her eyes and activated her sharing for a moment, although she was pretty sure of what she'd find. His chakra was pulsing unevenly in a fashion that indicated he was either under a genjutsu or very drunk. Since the first was out of the question, she settled on the second, however unlike him it was. In the 14 years they had been married, he'd only drank as heavily as he had been in the last few weeks when it looked like Konoha was going to have to surrender to Iowa. It was plain he was under an enormous amount of stress, and since he apparently felt he couldn't unburden himself to her, he'd gone looking for comfort at the bottom of a sake bottle. He grunted, standing with some effort. "We have a guest." She was hoping he was too inebriated to notice the shoes this soon, but luck wasn't with her. One of Sasake's school friends is ill, and his parents couldn't take care of him. "I volunteered to look after him for a couple of days." A strange, calculating look passed over her husband's face, who didn't have the presence of mind to hide it. "That was kind of you," he said, slurring his words ever so slightly. "Who's it, the Uzuki boy?" She covered her flinch behind a yawn. It had never been a secret, but she didn't want it to be on the forefront of his mind, either. Perhaps she had relied too much on his willful ignorance of Sasake's life in her domestic sphere. She had expected him to be angry and had prepared herself to counter it. Whatever he was, it wasn't angry. Satisfied would have been closer or triumphant. "You don't mind?" she asked. "Why'd I mind?" he said. "The village takes care of its own." "Of course, but he's fond of you and Sash." "Yes, I suppose," she answered, bewildered at the track the conversation was taking. "Good. I'm sure the boy has few enough people that treat him well." "Lame no, he's always welcome in my house," Fugaku said and brushed past her on the way to their bedroom. Belatedly, Mikoto remembered the glass she'd wandered into the kitchen to fill. She set it below the tap and looked out the window towards the darkened street. Fugaku was not a kind man and never fed her sweet lies to spare her own feelings. He had despised Kusha and offered no more than grudging respect to Minato. A hatred of the QB was one of the few things, until recently they had held in common. He had little enough attention to spare for his own youngest son, never mind one of the boy's friends. She was not sure of the root of his interest in Nar, but she was sure it would end up doing him no good. "Ooh. Thankfully, the child in question made no appearance the next morning, and Fugaku was in too foul a mood from last night's drinking to go looking for him before work. Sasaki Cid led around his father's scowl and made a break for it as soon as Mikoto handed him his lunch. She put together a generous pot of coffee and then made herself scarce until the front door slammed. Naruto wasn't in his bed when she poked her head into the guest room after everyone else had left. She did find him asleep on the adjacent bathroom's tile, which was rather a mess. "That's no place to be napping," she said gently, and lifted him into her arms. Cleaning up could wait until he was back in bed. He was short for his age and still awfully thin, even with her supplemental meals. Sleepily, he nuzzled against her neck and yawned. "Is it morning? Do I have to get up?" "Not if your stomach is still upset." She felt him nod. "I'm never eating anything ever again," he moaned. She chuckled. "You'll feel better soon. I promise. I'll make you some ginger tea later. That might help." "Mikoto Obakan," he whispered and brought his arms up to encircle her neck. "I wish you were my mom." Mikoto was silent for a long time, not trusting the strength of her voice. "I knew your mother," she said finally. "Let's get you back into bed, and I'll tell you about her." She carried him into the other room, tucked the blankets around his shoulders and searched for a place to begin. Her name was Yusuzuki Kusha. She was from Yusuzu Shioke, but had to leave her home when it was destroyed in the Third War. Yusuzu and Konoha had always been friends, and so the people of Konoha opened their gates to the refugees and let them make a new home in our village. Kusha's parents were killed before she could remember anything about them like yours. All she knew was that they were very brave shinobi. Mikoto paused and smiled. "Like yours, really," Naruto said, coming fully awake. Kusha and I were in the same class at the academy. The first day of school, she announced she was going to be the first girl Kage ever, and she never kept quiet about it. Because she wasn't from Konoha, some of the kids teased her for having an accent and bringing weird things to eat for lunch. She spent so much time in the principal's office for getting into fights. She hardly got any studying done, and she was at the bottom of the class every time report cards came out. My parents were very strict, and I spent most of my time training when I was little, so I was always at the top. I thought she was crazy and tried to ignore her. Somehow, she did graduate on time, though, and we were put on the same genin team. Usually the students are grouped together depending on how well their skills fit, but it's also traditional to put the best and the worst students on the same team to try to balance it out. At the time, I thought it was horrible and wanted to switch for another sensei. Kusha was really loud and short-tempered and never stopped moving. "Like me," he interrupted. "Just like you," she agreed. "And she loved playing jokes on people. She was terrible about trying to prank Arjun, an instructor, just to get a rise out of him. He was a very skilled ninja, and he hardly ever fell for them. Even the few times he did, he never got angry at her. She did it to me, too, but I wasn't nearly as patient as he was. And after a while, I started trying to get her back. I was the genjutsu specialist, which is really good for messing with people without getting yourself in trouble. By the way, once I convinced her she was a cat for almost an entire D-rank babysitting mission, the next week she put food coloring in my water bottle. So, my tongue was bright blue when it was my turn to deliver the oral mission report. It went downhill from there since pretty soon we figured out that between Kasha's crazy ideas and my genjutsu skills, we were unstoppable. And not just for messing with our teacher either. We went on a lot of missions together while we were Jonin and then Chunin. We looked out for each other and after a while we figured out we'd become best friends. Even though we argued with each other all the time, eventually I was promoted to Jonin and she wasn't, but she didn't mind. She wasn't the sort of person that got jealous of other people's good luck. When we were 17, she was kidnapped. She had a very special kind of chakra and someone from another village wanted to use it for themselves. I wanted to go rescue her myself, but I'd broken 3 fingers on my last mission and couldn't make hand signs. Another Jonin was picked to lead the mission instead. He was a really amazing shinobi, better than me, although I wouldn't have been caught dead admitting it at the time. He was the only one to pick up your mother's trail, and he killed the men who took her and brought her home. A little while after that, they started dating. Kusha could be kind of mean to her boyfriends, but this one stuck with her. Mikoto leaned in closer. It helped that he was too fast for her to punch him that hard. Naruto giggled, which unfortunately dissolved into a fit of coughing. She was about to reach for the basin when he pushed her hands away. "I'm okay," he said. "My throat just hurts. Keep going." "All right," she said while he settled back against the pillows. Some of the boys in our class that used to tease her for being a tomboy were regretting it because she grew up to be very beautiful. Her boyfriend was the first person to tell her that after he saved her from the kidnappers. Maybe that was when they fell in love. He was a good person, very calm, smart, and generous. I was very happy for her. After dating a few years, they got married. Living with him made Kasha a better person, too. She became more patient and didn't get angry so much or so quickly. A few years after that, Kasha found out she was pregnant with you. She retired from being a shinobi, so nothing would hurt you while you were growing inside her. She was really excited about becoming a mother. She loved you even before she met you. I had gotten married before her, and I was pregnant with Sasuke at the same time. She wanted you two to be as good friends as we were. Mikoto lapsed into a brief silence. The story was much too short. Nar didn't deserve it to end there, but end it had. She breathed deeply to steady herself. I'm sorry, Nar, but that's all there is. The night you were born was the night the QB attacked Konoha. Your mother and father were killed trying to protect you and all the other children who couldn't protect themselves. I know, he said, subdued. It's why I don't have a real birthday. Everybody around me is thinking about the people they love that died. He nestled further under the sheets. You never told me what she looks like. Well, she said, I don't have to tell you. I can do better. I'll be right back. She went to the sun room and pulled the picture frame out from behind an overgrown philodendron, dusting it off as she walked back to his bed. It was her official team portrait. The three of them were arrayed in front of lanky Tsukumo-sensei. On his face the sad half-smile that never grew into the real thing. Tsukumo Desiro and herself had all posed themselves with the dignity befitting a shinobi. Kasha was flashing the victory sign with both hands and grinning like a psycho. Wordlessly, she handed Nar the picture. He sat up and took it in both hands as if it might disappear unless he held on tight. He touched her face with the tip of his thumb and the first of his tears she had ever seen began rolling down his cheeks. She put her arm around his back and let him cry. I'm not sad, he said when the sniffling abated and he'd scrubbed his face dry on his shirt. I'm crying because I'm happy here, he said and handed it back. Mikoto gently pushed the photograph against his chest and pulled his hand over it. I have the negatives. Keep it. So guys, what do you think about this Naruto story? Tell me your opinion in the comments. And if you want more Naruto What If stories, make sure to subscribe to Universe of Naruto. Thanks for watching.